The Antwerp Cross by Anthony Darter, Chapter 1. The rain had been hitting the frosted glass of the office door since dawn, a steady, monotonous drone that sounded like a roll of wet drums. Through the translucent pane, the neon sign of the theater across the boulevard bled a hazy, fractured red into the gloom of the room. I sat back in my desk chair, the springs giving their familiar, metallic groan as I shifted my weight. The office was warm, a thick pocket of air smelling of radiator steam, cheap floor wax, and the sharp, clean burn of the fresh pot of coffee brewing on the hot plate near the filing cabinets. "You're tracking mud, Jack," a voice barked from the front desk. I didn't have to look up to know Sarge was glaring at my wingtips. She sat perfectly erect, her spine a straight line of uncompromising whack discipline that hadn't softened a bit since she traded her olive drabs for a civilian blouse. Her typewriter was clicking in perfect military intervals, a relentless clack, clack, clack as she systematically transferred names from a stack of municipal land ledgers into our cross-reference files. Beside her desk, curled into a tight, glossy crescent on top of the radiator, Hammett blinked his green eyes once, completely indifferent to the tension, before burying his black nose back into his fur. "It's raining, Sarge," I muttered, taking a sip from a heavy ceramic mug. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, exactly how she always made it. "The city's made of mud today. The city is made of poor planning and loose morals," Sarge countered, not missing a single beat on the keys. Return zing. "Neither is an excuse for ruining the linoleum." Joe managed to wipe his feet. From his chair across the room, Joe let out a dry, low chuckle from behind the comics section of the Examiner. He didn't look up, just adjusted his toothpick with his tongue. "Don't drag me into it, Sarge. I know better than to cross you." Before Sarge could launch into a lecture on administrative order, the brass doorknob rattled and the frosted door burst inward. The rain-drenched wind didn't just blow into the room, it brought Paulie with it. He stumbled inside, his overcoat soaked to a dark, heavy charcoal, his fedora dripping onto his collar. His cane hit the floor with a sharp, wet clack as he struggled to slam the door shut against the gale. He stood there for a second, panting, looking like a man who had just swam across the Pacific in a woolen suit. "Don't say a word," Paulie gasped, pointing a dripping finger at me before I could even open my mouth. "Not one single word, Jack. Single word." He limped heavily over to the leather couch against the wall, practically collapsing sideways onto the cushions with a long, theatrical groan. He tossed his wet hat onto the low-end table, where it immediately formed a small puddle on the wood and dug his heels in like he'd been cast out into the wilderness. Hammett lifted his head from the radiator, gave Paulie a look of profound aristocratic disapproval, and let out a soft hiss before going back to sleep. "Trouble on the home front?" Joe asked, finally folding his paper down an inch. Paulie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Trouble? Joe, trouble is a flat tire. Trouble is a bad day at the track. What I am living through is a systematic dismantling of the Geneva Convention, right inside my own four walls." I leaned my elbows on my desk, leaning forward. This was the best part of my week. "What did Veronica do now, Paulie?" "The workbench, Jack," Paulie said, his voice rising an octave, his hands flying up in dramatic despair. "My workbench, in the garage, the one place in the city of Los Angeles where a man should be allowed to have a little honest, disorganized peace. I go out there last night to grease the hinges on my tackle box, and what do I find? Mason jars." "Mason jars?" I repeated, grinning. "Labeled, Jack, labeled." She spent 3 hours out there with a grease pencil and a ball of twine. My wood screws are separated by length. My finishing nails are sorted by gauge. I couldn't find my ball-peen hammer because it was resting under a sign that said, "Hand tools only." A man can't work under those kind of totalitarian conditions. Sarge's typewriter suddenly went dead silent. She turned slowly in her swivel chair, her eyes locking onto Polly like a pair of radar dishes. A structured workspace increases efficiency by 30%, Polly. Your wife is a saint. My wife is a drill sergeant without a uniform, Sarge. No offense, Polly added quickly, shrinking back slightly under her gaze. He turned back to me, his face a mask of tragic warning. And the kitchen, Jack. Don't get me started on the kitchen. I walk in for breakfast this morning expecting a couple of eggs, maybe a strip of bacon. What do I get? Boiled cabbage. At 7 in the morning, Jack. She reads one article in a ladies' magazine about cleansing the system, and suddenly my digestive tract is public property. I'm on a kitchen timer curfew. If I'm 10 minutes late for dinner tonight, she told me my plate goes to the neighbor's hound. Leaning his head back against the leather couch, he looked at me with deep, exaggerated pity. You think you're sitting pretty because you and Rose just got those rings on your fingers? Polly muttered, shaking his head. You think it's all blue skies and neon lights. But I'm telling you, it's a countdown clock, Jack. Enjoy the diner food while you can, because sooner or later, the boiled cabbage comes for us all. I just chuckled, rubbing a thumb against the rim of my mug. Polly's cynical prophecies didn't touch me. Just an hour ago, before the rain really started coming down, I'd been sitting at the counter at Rose's Diner. She had packed my lunch in a neat metal tin, ham and cheese on rye, thick crusts, no cabbage in sight, fixed the crooked knot of my tie with her warm hands, and given me a quiet kiss that still felt like a shield against the rest of this rotten city. I'll take my chances, Polly, I said softly. You're a fool, Polly grumbled, sinking back into the couch cushions. A happy, doomed fool. The room settled back into its comfortable rhythm. The radiator clanked, the typewriter started its steady rhythm again, and the smell of coffee filled the space. It was a good morning. We were safe, the rent was paid, and the world outside of the window was someone else's problem. Then the brass doorknob rattled again. But this wasn't Polly's frantic fumbling. This was a slow, deliberate turn. The typewriter stopped. Joe's newspaper went completely flat against his knee. My hand instinctively dropped beneath the shadow of my desk, my fingers finding the cold, reassuring checkering. On the walnut grip of my .45, the door opened, and the comedy left the room, swallowed whole by the damp, heavy shadow of the street. But it wasn't a desperate client or a threat. The massive, unmistakable frame of Dogface filled the doorway, his broad shoulders easily blocking out the gray light of the hallway. He was wearing his usual heavy wool overcoat, dark with rain across the shoulders, and his fedora was pulled low over his prominent, scarred brow. Behind him, looking like he'd stepped straight out of a clothing catalog, despite the downpour, was Handsome. Handsome closed the door behind them, shutting out the roar of the boulevard traffic, and gave a smooth, practiced shake of his umbrella before propping it in the brass stand by Sarge's desk. Morning, fellas, Handsome said, his voice as smooth as velvet as he unbuttoned his dry-cleaned coat. Sarge, you look lovely as always. Sarge didn't stop typing, her fingers keeping up that steady clack, 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 but the corner of her mouth twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. Wipe your feet, George. You too, large and in charge. Dogface let out a low, rumbling grunt that sounded like a truck engine, idling in a cave. He methodically stomped his heavy boots on the mat, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Polly stretched out on the leather couch. What's the matter with him? Dogface rumbled, pointing a thick, calloused thumb at the sofa. He looked like he got run over by a trolley. Worse, Joe said, folding his newspaper down and shaking his head. Veronica reorganized his garage. He's a broken man. I just don't know how he is going to live like this. Polly didn't even lift his head from the cushions. He just held up a single hand, waving it weakly in the air. Go ahead, laugh it up, boys. Wait until your women find out about mason jars. You won't be smiling when your tobacco is sorted by alphabetical order. Handsome chuckled, sliding into a chair near Joe's desk, while Dogface walked over to the radiator, pulling off his heavy leather gloves. He looked down at Hammett, who was still curled up in a tight black ball. The massive enforcer reached out a hand that could crush a bowling ball and gently tapped the cat's ear with a single finger. Hammett didn't even open his eyes. He just let out a loud, vibrating purr, completely accustomed to the giant. "So, what brings Don Pandolini's finest out into the deluge?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. I took my hand off the grip of my .45 under the desk, letting my arms relax. While the city outside was changing fast after the war, inside these walls, the family was intact. "The old man needs someone bumped off, or are you two just hiding out from the weather?" "Bit of both, Jack," Handsome said, his tone turning a fraction more serious as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The old man's got his ears to the ground. There's been a lot of movement down by the rails the last few nights. New faces, out-of-town accents, the kind of guys who don't know who owns the pavement they're walking on." Dogface grunted in agreement, his scarred face tightening. "They're sloppy, but they're heavy." I nodded slowly, the easygoing mood in the room shifting just a bit. Settling into that familiar, professional quiet, the rain kept up its steady, rhythmic drumming against the frosted glass. A reminder that the city never stayed quiet for long. But for now, with the coffee hot and the whole crew packed into the room, the storm outside could wait its turn. Chapter 2. The silence that followed Handsome's warning down by the rails was the heavy, suffocating kind that usually precedes a lightning strike. For a few long seconds, the only sound in the office was the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the radiator cooling down and the steady, relentless drum of the rain against the glass. I looked down at the desk blotter, my mind tracking what Handsome had just laid out. Out-of-town muscle down by the railyards. Sloppy but heavy. Los Angeles was expanding like a balloon, and everyone wanted a piece of the string. But Don Pandolini didn't tolerate uninvited guests on his pavement, and if his scouts were already flagging them, it meant the temperature of the city was about to drop below freezing. "They come from the east?" Joe asked, breaking the silence. He didn't look up from his paper, but his toothpick had gone completely still between his teeth. "The wind says Chicago or New York," Handsome replied smoothly, leaning back and crossing one immaculate trousers leg over the other. He didn't have a speck of mud on his shoes, a minor miracle, given the soup outside. They're wearing heavy wool that smells like coal smoke and talking with that sharp, clipped accent that don't belong in the basin. They're asking questions about local routes, warehouse space, and who handles the manifest sheets at the Santa Fe terminal. Dogface grunted from his spot by the radiator. He had his massive hands spread out over the iron fins, soaking in the heat. "They don't know the rules, Jack. They stepped on one of our numbers runners in the 3rd Ward yesterday morning. Didn't even ask who he worked for. Just broke his wrist and took the envelope. It's uncivilized." "Uncivilized is a polite word for it," Paulie muttered from the couch. He had finally sat up, though he still looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck. He adjusted his damp collar with a frown. "A guy can't even walk his route without some imported muscle trying to change the management. It's getting so an honest citizen can't find any peace, whether he's on the clock or hiding out in his own garage." "You wouldn't know peace if it bit you on the ass, Paulie," Sarge said without looking up from her typewriter. Her fingers hit the keys with a sharp, rhythmic vengeance. Clack, 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 return, zing. The world is moving forward. If some out-of-town elements want to try their luck against the Don's logistics, they'll find out the hard way that Los Angeles isn't a terminal station. It's a dead end. I let out a soft breath, my eyes drifting to the black phone sitting on the corner of my desk. It remained stubbornly quiet. Usually, when the underworld started grinding its teeth, our phone was the first thing to rattle. But right now, we were just sitting in the middle of the calm before the storm, listening to the rain and watching Hammett twitch his whiskers as he dreamed of catching mice. Then, The doorknob rattled again. It wasn't the heavy, familiar bang of one of our own. It was a slow, deliberate turn of the brass, the mechanism clicking with a crisp, expensive precision that didn't belong to the neighborhood. The typewriter keys stopped instantly. The sudden silence in the office, so loud it made my ears ring. Joe's newspaper dropped an inch, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the door. On the couch, Paulie straightened his spine, his hand automatically reaching down to make sure his tie was straight. Even Dogface turned his massive head away from the radiator, his scarred brow furrowing into a hard, protective ridge. My right hand didn't rush, but it didn't hesitate either. It slid beneath the shadow of my desk, my fingers wrapping around the checkered walnut grip of my .45. The steel was cool against my palm, a heavy, comforting weight that had kept me breathing through the worst nights the war and the streets could throw at me. I didn't pull it from the leather. I just held it there, waiting for the door to swing. The door eased open, and the light comedy of the morning was instantly swallowed whole by the damp, heavy shadow of the hallway. She didn't rush into the room. She stepped through the threshold with a quiet, practiced grace that belonged to the kind of restaurants where they don't print the prices on the menu. The moment she entered, the wind caught the hem of her silk trench coat, swirling a mist of expensive French perfume into our little pocket of radiator steam and stale coffee. It was something sweet but heavy. Jasmine left out to rot in a thunderstorm. She turned and closed the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click, shutting out the roar of the boulevard traffic. For a long second, nobody moved. The woman stood there, dripping slightly onto Sarge's clean linoleum, looking us over like a theater critic sizing up a bad opening night. She pulled back her silk hood, shaking out a cascade of dark, perfectly coiffed hair that hadn't been ruined by the downpour. She was beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty that came with a high maintenance cost and a distinct warning label. Her skin was pale, making her lips look too red, like a splash of fresh ink on a clean sheet of paper, and her eyes were a cool, calculating shade of flint. Her gaze paused on Sarge's desk, skipped over Paulie on the couch, lingered for a fraction of a second on the massive frame of Dogface, and finally settled on me behind my desk. "Mr. Morgan?" she asked. Her voice was low, smoky, and had the kind of polished cadence that came from finishing schools back east, not the public pavement of the West Coast. "Depends on who's asking," I said. I kept my hand flat against the grip of the .45 under the desk, my eyes tracking the way she held her leather handbag. She wasn't trembling, and she wasn't looking for a place to dry off. She was taking the temperature of the room. She walked over, her high heels tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against the floorboards that sounded like a countdown clock. She didn't stop until she was standing right at the edge of my desk, close enough for that jasmine perfume to push the smell of Sarge's paint-stripping coffee right out of my lungs. She didn't look at the cracked varnish on the wood or the grease pencil marks on my blotter. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her trench coat with a gloved hand, pulled out a thick banded stack of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills, and dropped it right next to my ceramic mug. The weight of the paper hit the desk with a solid, heavy thud. "My name is Evelyn Sinclair," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, hard and unwavering. "And that is a $1,000 retainer to ensure your undivided attention." I looked down at the money. The ink was fresh, the edges sharp. $1,000 is a mountain of cabbage, enough to pay the office rent for a year, keep Joe in toothpicks, and ensure Rose's Diner had enough premium coffee beans to survive a winter. But money that clean usually came from places that were incredibly dirty. I slowly drew my hand out from under the desk, leaving the gun in its holster, and picked up the stack. I flipped the edge with my thumb, listening to the crisp snap of the bills. $1,000 buys a lot of undivided attention, Miss Sinclair," I said. setting the stack back down exactly in the center of my desk. Usually, when a lady drops that kind of freight on a rainy Tuesday, she's trying to catch a husband doing something he shouldn't be doing. But you don't look like a woman who needs a private eye to handle a man. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of her red lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. My marital status is intact, Mr. Morgan. I'm here about my brother, Frederick. Behind me, I heard the faint leather creak of Joe shifting in his chair. Over by the radiator, Dogface and Handsome hadn't moved an inch, but the air in the room had changed. The easygoing morning was gone, replaced by the familiar, cold pressure of a case. Frederick? I asked, leaning back until my chair gave its metallic groan. What about him? He's missing, she said, her voice dropping a fraction, taking on a trembling, fragile edge that sounded just a little too perfect, like a line rehearsed in front of a bedroom vanity mirror until the tears fell on cue. He vanished 3 days ago from his apartment on the east side. He's a quiet boy, Mr. Morgan, a clerk at a shipping firm down by the docks. He's never been in trouble a day in his life. But lately, he's fallen into a bad crowd. Men from out of town. Vicious men who don't belong in the city. She squeezed a small lace handkerchief between her gloved fingers, her shoulders shaking with a delicate, practiced tremor. I'm terrified they've done something to him, she whispered, looking up at me through thick, dark lashes. The police won't listen to me. They say he probably just went on a bender down on Main Street. But I know my brother. Please, Mr. Morgan. Find Frederick. Bring him back to me before it's too late. I looked at her, then I looked back down at the pristine cut of her silk coat. I took in the gold clasp on her leather handbag and the expensive, unblemished leather of her shoes. For the sister of a low-level shipping clerk living in a tenement on the east side, she was wearing a small fortune. My gut, the one that still gave me a sharp, ugly twist whenever the weather turned and the West Hollywood warehouse scar started aching, started throbbing. She was laying it on thick, playing the desperate, weeping sibling to a T. But the math didn't add up, and the pavement had taught me a long time ago that when the math doesn't add up in Los Angeles, someone usually ends up in a box. A shipping clerk, I murmured, tapping a single finger against the stack of $100 bills. And he lives on the east side. Tell me, Miss Sinclair, where does a clerk's sister get $1,000 in fresh cash to throw at a couple of broken-down private investigators? Her eyes flared for a fraction of a second, a flash of hard, unadulterated steel that told me exactly what kind of woman was really standing under that silk hood. The fragile sister vanished, replaced by something much older and much hungrier. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the mask slid back into place. Our family has certain resources, Mr. Morgan, she said smoothly, her voice steady. And Frederick is all I have left in this world. Does the money buy your services, or do I need to find an agency down the street that doesn't ask so many questions? I didn't answer right away. I looked across the room. Joe hadn't moved, but his eyes were locked on the gold clasp of her bag. Behind her, by the radiator, Handsome and Dogface exchanged a single heavy look. The out-of-town accents Handsome had just warned me about down by the rails suddenly didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. I reached out, took the stack of bills, and slid them into my top desk drawer, turning the key until the lock clicked home. The money buys our time, Miss Sinclair, but it doesn't buy our blindness, I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the blotter. You see, a shipping clerk making $35 a week doesn't have a sister who drops $1,000 in uncirculated C notes on a rainy Tuesday. And he doesn't get the attention of the kind of out-of-town muscle that's currently turning the east side upside down. She went perfectly still, her lace handkerchief freezing between her fingers. Let's cut through the bullshit, sweetheart, I continued, my voice dropping into a low, flat register. Your brother Frederick isn't checking manifests at the pier. He's probably some low-level pusher running horse for an outfit that didn't print their permits in the city. He's a heroin dealer, Miss Sinclair, isn't he? And he didn't just vanish. He stole something from the wrong people, and now he's running like a scared little bunny rabbit. The fragile act didn't just slide off her this time. It shattered. She straightened up, her shoulders squaring, as she let out a short, sharp breath that cut right through the sweet perfume. The damsel was gone. "You think you're very smart, don't you, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, her voice losing every drop of its finishing school warmth, turning as sharp and jagged as a broken bottle in an alleyway. "I'm smart enough to smell through your bullshit. You have a tell when you lie. You should probably work on that," I said, pulling a fresh notepad toward me and uncapping my fountain pen. "Now, if you want us to find him before the men from Chicago put him in a concrete tuxedo, you're going to tell me exactly what Frederick took and exactly who he took it from. Start talking." Miss Sinclair stood by my desk for a long, heavy beat, her eyes cutting through the smoke-tinged air of the office. She looked at me, then her gaze flicked to Joe, who was still leaning back with his toothpick dead still, and finally over her shoulder at the massive, silent silhouettes of Dogface and Handsome by the radiator. She knew she was cornered, but a woman like Evelyn didn't fold her hand. She just changed her strategy. Slowly, she reached up with her gloved hands and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her silk trench coat. I didn't move, and my pen stayed poised over the notepad. She reached deep into an interior pocket, not her purse, and pulled out a thick bundle wrapped in a piece of faded, water-stained green velvet. She didn't drop it this time. She laid it down on the desk blotter between us with an unexpected reverence, her fingers lingering on the cloth for a second before she pulled them away. "You're right about Frederick," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, icy register that had completely discarded the weeping sister act. "He's a fool. He thought he could run errands for the out-of-towners, pocket a few extra envelopes, and walk away clean. But 3 days ago, they used him to move a shipment coming off a private vessel at the San Pedro slips. They didn't tell him what was in the crates. They just told him to guard the locker." She reached down and carefully peeled back the folds of the heavy green velvet. "Frederick opened one," she whispered. The velvet fell flat against my desk, and the dim, fractured red light from the theater sign across the boulevard caught the object inside. The office seemed to get a fraction quieter, the steady drum of the LA downpour fading into the background against the sheer, heavy presence of what was sitting on my blotter. It was a cross, but it wasn't the kind you saw hanging from the altar at St. Vincent's, and it sure as hell didn't belong in a tenement apartment on the east side. It was roughly 10 inches long, cast from a dense, heavy gold that had aged into a deep, honeyed bronze, interwoven with thick bands of tarnished silver filigree. The craftsmanship was old, medieval old, with intricate, tiny figures of saints and martyrs carved into the metal, their miniature faces worn smooth by centuries of hands. But it was the stones that took the air out of the room. Embedded at the center was a rough-cut, deep crimson ruby the size of a walnut, surrounded by a cluster of dark, bruised blue sapphires that looked like frozen ink. Even in the dingy light of a rainy Tuesday, the thing practically bled. It looked ancient, heavy with history, and entirely out of place next to my ceramic coffee mug. "The Antwerp cross," Evelyn said, her eyes reflecting the dull glint of the gold. "It belonged to a Belgian aristocratic family before the occupation. The men Frederick was working for, the Castellano crew out of Chicago, didn't bring it to the States to sell it to a museum. They brought it here to pay for their entry into the Southern California market. It was supposed to be a tribute to Grease the Wheels." Joe let out a low, appreciative whistle, finally putting his newspaper down completely. He leaned over his desk, his eyes wide as he took in the relic. "That ain't just a tribute, Jack. That's a king's ransom. A pusher doesn't just stumble into a piece like that." "Frederick did," Evelyn countered, her flinty eyes snapping over to Joe. "He realized what they had, panicked, and stole it right out of the locker before the exchange could happen. He thought he could use it as leverage to buy his way out of the syndicates. Instead, he put a target on his back the size of the City Hall tower." I reached out, my fingers hovering over the ancient metal before I actually touched it. When I lifted it by the stem, the weight of it surprised me. It felt less like jewelry and more like a weapon. The cold of the gold bit into my palm, and as I turned it over, the damp chill in the air seemed to settle right into my old West Hollywood warehouse scar. "And where is Frederick now, Evelyn?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the cross as I laid it back down on the velvet. "I don't know," she admitted, and for the first time since she'd walked in, she sounded genuinely afraid. "He called me from a payphone near the railyards 2 nights ago. He was terrified. He said the Castellanos had hit his apartment, that they were combing the east side block by block. He told me he was going to hole up somewhere close to the tracks until he could find a way out of the city. He slipped the cross to me through a luggage locker at the Union Station terminal." She leaned over the desk, her red lips pressed into a thin, desperate line. "They know he has it, Mr. Morgan. And if they find him, they'll kill him slow just to find out where he hid it. I don't care about the gold. I don't care about the Chicago crew. I want my brother alive. You keep the $1,000. You can even keep the cross if it buys his life. Just find him before the Castellanos do." I looked down at the cross, then over at Dogface and Handsome. The two enforcers hadn't moved from the radiator, but their faces had gone hard as granite. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. And it wasn't just a local beef. A piece of freight like this, brought into the city by an out-of-town family without Don Pandolini's say-so, meant a full-scale territorial war was already sitting on our doorstep. I picked up my fountain pen, the ink wet and black on the notepad. "The railyards are a big place, Miss Sinclair," I said, my voice flat. "But a scared junkie with a crew from Chicago on his heels leaves a trail if you know where to look. Joe, get your coat. We're going to go have a look at Frederick's old playground before the rain washes away whatever luck he's got left." Chapter 3. I held the Antwerp cross for a few more seconds, feeling the cold, dead weight of it press into the skin in my palm. The crimson ruby at the center seemed to catch every spare bit of gloom in the office, turning it into a dull, bloody spark. I didn't put it in my desk drawer next to the retainer. I didn't wrap it back up in the green velvet to hide it under the floorboards. I looked across the desk at Evelyn Sinclair. Her eyes were wide, her breath hitched, waiting to see if the bait had hooked me. Then I looked past her. Paulie was leaning forward from the couch, his domestic miseries totally forgotten, his eyes glued to the gold. Joe Russo had his hand on his chin, his mind already calculating the body count this thing was going to rack up before the week was out. Behind them, Sarge's hands were poised over her keys, the typewriter dead silent, her eyes reflecting the hard reality of what just walked through our door. If I kept this piece of metal in the office, the Castellano crew wouldn't just knock on the door next time. They'd bring Tommy guns and enough kerosene to burn the whole block to the pavement. I had a wife down the street at the diner. Joe had a life. Paulie had Veronica and a house with labeled mason jars. Sarge had her quiet routine. "Take it," I said flatly. I didn't say it to Joe, and I didn't say it to Evelyn. I leaned across the desk, completely ignoring the lady, and extended my arm toward the radiator. Handsome stepped forward first, his smooth demeanor slipping for a fraction of a second as he looked at the heavy gold in my hand. But it was Dogface who reached out, his massive, scarred hand closing around the top of the cross. His fingers were twice the size of mine, his knuckles calloused from a lifetime of enforcing the Don's law. But he took the relic with a surprising, delicate care. "Jack," Paulie blurted out from the couch, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing? That's a death sentence, Paulie," I cut him off, my voice dropping into a hard, uncompromising register. I turned my eyes back to Evelyn, whose face had gone pale, her red lips parting in shock. "You brought a war into my office, Miss Sinclair. For $1,000, I'll find your junkie brother. That's the job. But I don't keep the loot. Keeping this thing here puts a target on the back of every person in this room, and I don't gamble with their lives." "But it's my leverage," Evelyn hissed, her voice rising as she stepped closer to the desk, her gloved hands slamming against the wood. "If the Castellanos find out I don't have it, the Castellanos are already in our backyard. I said, leaning forward until we were eye to eye. They're down by the rails. They broke a numbers runner's wrist yesterday morning. This isn't your private game anymore, sweetheart. The minute this cross touched Los Angeles soil without permission, it became Don Pandolini's business. I looked back up at Handsome and Dogface. The massive enforcer had already slipped the cross into the deep, interior pocket of his heavy wool overcoat, his broad chest hiding the bulge completely. Take it straight to the old man, I told them. Tell him Chicago brought a tribute into the basin to buy out the Southern California market, and their boy lost it. Don Pandolini keeps it safe. When the Castellano family realizes that Don is holding their crown jewel, he'll have enough leverage to break their backs before they can even set up a single operational phone line. Handsome gave a slow, cold nod, his sharp eyes glinting with professional appreciation. The old man is going to love this, Jack. It changes the weather completely. Just make sure it gets there clean, I said. Dogface didn't say a word. He just patted the front of his coat with one heavy hand, gave Sarge a brief, respectful tip of his fedora, "Morning, Sarge," and turned toward the door. Handsome followed him, his umbrella tucked neatly under his arm, his smooth stride perfectly synchronized with the giant beside him. They opened the door, stepped out into the gray, rain-slicked hallway, and closed it behind them with a firm, solid click. The heavy air in the office seemed to lift by about 50 pounds the moment that Cross left the room. I turned my attention back to the woman standing in front of my desk. The high and mighty finishing school act was completely dead, and the calculating criminal was left standing in its place, her shoulders tense beneath her wet silk coat. "Now, Miss Sinclair," I said, picking up my fountain pen and tapping the nib against the fresh notepad. "The Don has the gold, which means the Chicago crew is going to be very busy dealing with him. That gives us a little running room to find your brother Frederick before they turn him into fish food. Sit down, stop lying, and tell me exactly where he holes up when he's desperate." The door hadn't even fully clicked shut behind Dogface and Handsome before the air inside the room turned white hot. Evelyn stood frozen for a fraction of a second, her eyes staring at the empty space on my desk where the Antwerp cross had just been sitting. She looked like a woman who had pulled the pin on a grenade, only to realize someone had swapped the explosive for a blank. She had played the entire hand counting on the old, reliable engine of human nature. Greed. She thought the luster of that ancient gold, the sheer intoxicating gravity of a king's ransom, would be too much for a couple of broken-down private eyes to resist. Then her face contorted. The porcelain doll finish vanished, replaced by an ugly, mottled mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was seeing red. "Are you fucking insane?" she screamed. The finishing school cadence didn't just crack. It dissolved into a gutter-level screech. She didn't just step forward, she leaped. Her gloved hands clawed at the air. She pitched her weight right over the edge of my desk, lunging straight for my throat with her nails bared like an alley cat cornered by a hound. I didn't flinch, and I didn't reach for the gun. I didn't have to. I would never lay a hand on a woman, no matter how deranged she went. But the woman standing 3 feet to her left didn't carry that particular baggage. Before Evelyn's fingers could even scrape the lapel of my suit, 2 hands like steel bands clamped down on her shoulders from the side. It was Sarge. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't treat her with kid gloves. With the one fluid, explosive burst of that old whack discipline, Sarge twisted her hips, caught Evelyn at the apex of her jump, and threw her backward. Evelyn hit the linoleum hard, her silk trench coat whipping around her legs with a sharp crack as she slid a good 2 feet, her expensive leather handbag skittering across the floor and spilling its contents against the filing cabinet. She lay there for a second, gasping for air, her dark, perfectly coiffed hair finally coming undone and spilling across her face in wild, tangled strands. Sarge didn't even look out of breath. She stood over the woman, her civilian blouse barely wrinkled, her spine perfectly straight. Her eyes were as cold and level as a pair of gun barrels. "I suggest you calm down, miss," Sarge said, her voice dropping into that flat, authoritative bark that used to make fresh recruits bounce quarters off their army cots. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was Evelyn's ragged, angry breathing and the rain drumming against the frosted glass. Paulie had scrambled backward onto the very top of the couch cushions, his legs tucked up out of the way, staring at Sarge with a brand new level of respect. Joe hadn't even stood up, but his hand had drifted inside his coat jacket, just in case the lady had a partner waiting in the hall. Slowly, the rage began to drain out of Evelyn, replaced by the cold, hollow realization that she had completely lost control of the room. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, shaking the hair out of her eyes, looking up at the four of us. We weren't the desperate marks she thought we were. We were a wall. "You've killed him," she whispered, her voice trembling now, though whether it was from lingering fury or genuine fear was hard to tell. "You've handed him to the sharks. He's as good as dead." "No," I said, leaning over my desk and looking down at her. "I kept your brother alive for another 12 hours. Don Pandolini has the gold now. If the Castellanos come looking for it, they have to knock on his door, not yours. Now get off Sarge's clean floor, sit in the chair, and give us the names, or Sarge might not be so gentle next time. Or you can walk out that door right now and see how far that silk coat gets you on the east side without a dime of leverage left." It took her another minute to gather herself. She stood up slowly, refusing Paulie's half-hearted offer to help her up, and aggressively smoothed down her ruined trench coat. She sat in the leather armchair across from my desk, her face pale, her red lips pressed into a bloodless line. She didn't look at Sarge, who had already marched right back to her desk, adjusted her skirt, and set her fingers back over the home row of her typewriter like nothing had happened. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice was dead, stripped of every mask she'd worn since walking through the door. "He has 3 places," she said, staring at the desk. "If he's running, he's staying close to the tracks. There's a rooming house on 4th Street, the Willow. The landlady takes cash and doesn't keep a registry. If he isn't there, he goes to a pool hall called the Blind Pig down by the freight yards. The manager, a guy named Shorty, lets him use the back office when he's low on supply." I wrote the names down, my fountain pen scratching against the notepad. The Willow. The Blind Pig. "And the third?" Joe asked from across the room. "An abandoned cold storage warehouse near the Santa Fe terminal," she muttered, squeezing her hands together in her lap. "Section 4. He used to keep a cot there when things got heavy with the local pushers. That's everything. That's all I know, I swear to God." I finished the note, capping the pen with a soft, definitive click. "We'll start with the rooming house," I said, looking over at Joe, who was already reaching for his heavy Mackinaw coat. But as I looked down at the names on the pad, a cold, greasy feeling started to coil right in the pit of my stomach. My gut gave that familiar, ugly twist, the same one that usually meant a deal was sour before the ink was even dry. I looked up, meeting Joe's eyes. He had his coat halfway on, but his movements had slowed down. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at me, his brow furrowed in that specific way that meant his detective's brain was chewing on a bad tooth. I flicked my gaze over to the front desk. Sarge had stopped typing again. Her fingers were resting lightly on the keys, her eyes fixed on the spilled contents of Evelyn's purse near the filing cabinet. Even Paulie, still sitting awkwardly on the edge of the couch, had stopped adjusting his tie. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes darting between Evelyn and the desk. The room had gone completely quiet again, but it wasn't the clean, relieved silence that had followed the cross leaving the office. It was a thick, infected kind of quiet. Something was wrong. The story was too neat now. The rage had been real, the locations were real, and the heroin connection made sense. But there was a thread dangling out of the sweater, and every single one of us could feel the phantom tug of it. We had been on the pavement too long to believe in a perfect hand, and right now, Evelyn Sinclair was giving us exactly what we asked for a little too easily. I leaned back, the springs of my chair groaning into the silence, my eyes locking onto the pale woman in the armchair. "Joe," I said softly, not taking my eyes off her, "hold on to your coat for just a second." Joe stopped with his arm halfway through the sleeve. The office fell back into that suffocating stillness, the only movement being the smoke from Joe's cigarette curling toward the water-stained ceiling. I kept my eyes on Evelyn Sinclair, but my focus shifted down to the floor by the filing cabinet, where the contents of her purse had scattered. It wasn't the usual feminine clutter. There was no compact, no half-empty bottle of aspirin, no lipstick or keys. Spilled across Sarge's clean linoleum were 3 items that didn't fit the profile of a terrified finishing school sister. First was a heavy, nickel-plated Colt 38, the snub-nosed barrel, reflecting a dull, greasy glint of red light from the theater across the street. Next to it lay a small, black ledger, bound in oilskin, the kind numbers runners and high-level suppliers use to keep track of wholesale weights and drop-offs. And finally, sprawling out from a torn manila envelope, were 6 separate, high-quality photograph glossies. Joe stepped over, using the toe of his wingtip to flip one of the photos over so we could all see it. It was a surveillance shot, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed a man standing by a grease-stained loading dock down at the San Pedro Slips. The man in the photograph was Don Pandolini, caught in mid-conversation with his chief logistics captain. The silence in the room didn't just get heavy. It went ice cold. "You've got a hell of a hobby, Miss Sinclair," I said, my voice dropping into a dangerous, flat register. I leaned over the desk, resting my weight on my forearms. "That's a wholesale ledger for the Castellano crew. In those photos, that's surveillance on our people. You didn't just stumble into this information because your brother went missing. You're deep in the grease with Chicago." Evelyn didn't move. She didn't look down at the gun or the pictures, but the pale skin around her jaw tightened until it looked like stretched parchment. "Let me guess how the script was supposed to run," I continued, the pieces clicking together in my mind with the heavy, satisfying thud of a cylinder locking into a revolver frame. "There's no helpless brother, Frederick, waiting to be saved. Or rather, he's waiting, but he isn't a victim. He's armed to the teeth, hopped up on his own supply, and terrified out of his mind. You told us he's hiding near the tracks. You gave us 3 specific tight spots: the willow, the blind pig, Section 4. Polly let out a soft, breathy whistle from the top of the couch. A funnel. She was routing us into a bottleneck. "Exactly," I said, nodding slowly. She knew of our association with Pandolini. She knew we'd go down there with our irons hot, looking to drag her brother out by his collar. And she knew Frederick is so twitchy right now he'd take shots at anything that moves in the dark. The minute we walked into one of those rooms, the lead would start flying. Joe finally pulled his coat off, tossing it back onto his chair with a hard, disgusted slap. "She didn't want us to find him, Jack. She wanted us to kill him. Or she wanted him to kill us. Either way, the slate gets wiped clean." "That was the play, wasn't it, Evelyn?" I asked, my voice cutting through the damp air like a razor. "If Jack and Joe go down to the tracks and blast Frederick in self-defense, the Castellanos lose their rogue dealer. The heat on the east side dies down. And while we're busy trading lead with your brother in a dark rooming house, you walk out of this office with the Antwerp cross under your coat, clean and unaccounted for. You get the gold, Chicago gets their revenge, and the only casualties are a junkie who stole from his bosses and 2 private dicks who asked too many questions. You just didn't count on Sarge. Always make sure you have all the intel before you move forward with a plan." A slow, chilling transformation came over Evelyn Sinclair. The panic from Sarge's throw completely faded, replaced by a cold, arrogant stillness. She reached out, took a cigarette from the silver case that had rolled near her foot, and lit it with a tight, steady match. She blew a long stream of gray smoke straight at my face. It was a beautiful plan, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. It was neat. It had symmetry. Yeah, well, your train just hit a derailed switch, I said, leaning back until my chair gave its familiar metallic groan. You counted on us being greedy, and you counted on us being stupid. But the cross is gone. It's sitting in the back of Don Pandolini's car right now, surrounded by 400 pounds of local muscle. Your leverage is locked in a vault, and your brother is still out there with a target on his back. I looked across the room at Sarge. She didn't need an order. She reached down, picked up the nickel-plated .38 by the trigger guard, and tossed it into the bottom drawer of her desk, slamming it shut with a definitive bang. So here's how the new script reads, sweetheart, I told her, drawing a fresh line on my notepad. You're going to sit in that chair, and you're going to tell us exactly how Frederick plays when he's cornered. Because Joe and I are still going down to those railyards. We're still going to find your brother. Only this time, we know he's waiting for us with a loaded gun, and we don't plan on being the ones who end up in the morgue. Chapter 4. The Willow, I said, repeating the name of the rooming house as I grabbed my waterlogged fedora from the coat tree. I gave the brim a quick snap, sending a spray of gray drops against the baseboards. We start there. If Frederick is as twitchy as I think he is, he won't have the stomach to stay out in the open pool halls for long. Joe didn't say a word. He just slid his arms into the sleeves of his heavy coat, checked the cylinder on his snub-nosed Smith & Wesson with a quick, practiced flick of his wrist, and let it drop back into his pocket. His face had gone completely flat. The easygoing guy who had been chewing on a toothpick 5 minutes ago was gone, replaced by the veteran who knew exactly what a dark hallway smelled like when there was a scared junkie waiting at the end of it. I looked back over my shoulder at the front desk. Sarge, I said, checking the spare box of 45 shells in my top drawer before sliding them into my pocket. Keep the door locked until we call. If anyone else comes looking for a missing brother, tell them to go to hell. Sarge didn't look up from her typewriter, but her fingers paused on the home row. The door stays locked, Jack. Don't worry about the office. Just worry about the corners. Polly, I nodded toward the couch. Keep her company and keep your iron out of your pocket. Polly scrambled down from the top cushions, nodding fiercely. He reached into his coat to adjust his holster, his hand shaking just enough to make the leather creak. Evelyn Sinclair didn't look at any of us. She was still sitting in the leather armchair, staring at the blank spot on my desk where her leverage used to be. The cigarette between her fingers had burned down to a long, fragile stalk of gray ash, the smoke curling around her dark hair like a small, private storm cloud. She looked smaller now that the masks were gone, still dangerous, but stripped of the syndicate machinery she'd tried to use to crush us. Let's go, Joe, I said. We stepped out of the office, the frosted glass door clicking shut behind us, cutting off the dim red glow of the theater sign. The hallway smelled of old wool, floor wax, and the damp chill that always managed to seep through the brickwork whenever the basin took a beating from the Pacific. We took the stairs 2 at a time, our wingtips echoing in the narrow concrete well. When we hit the street door, the wind caught us flat in the face, carrying the sharp, metallic stench of the rail yards and the wet asphalt of the boulevard. Joe climbed into the passenger side of the DeSoto, pulling the door shut with a solid mechanical thud that cut the roar of the LA traffic down to a low rumble. He reached out and wiped a circle of condensation off the passenger window with his glove. Staring out into the gray soup, I turned the key and the inline 6-engine coughed once before settling into a deep, rhythmic purr beneath the hood. I threw the wipers on, watching the heavy rubber blades push the soot-stained water across the glass in steady, metronomic strokes. You think the junkie's still at the rooming house? Joe asked, his voice low against the rumble of the heater kicking in. If he's high enough, he's probably frozen to the bed, I said, shifting the DeSoto into gear and pulling out into the lane. The tires hissed against the wet pavement as we headed east toward 4th Street. But if he saw the Castellano boys combing the blocks, he's going to be watching that door with his finger on the trigger. We don't knock, Joe. We take the hinge. Joe nodded, his eyes locked on the dark, rain-soaked warehouses starting to crowd the edges of the boulevard. And what about the sister? We leave her with Sarge? Sarge can handle 3 of her, I said, turning the wheel as we crossed under the bridge, the shadow of the concrete span swallowing the car for a brief, dark second. But Evelyn's plan didn't factor in Pandolini getting the cross. Right now, Chicago thinks the junkie still has it. By the time we get to 4th Street, the whole east side is going to be crawling with wool coats that smell like coal smoke. I pressed down on the gas, the DeSoto leaping forward through the gray mist. The Willow was exactly the kind of dive where a guy went when he wanted the world to forget his name. The paint on the front door was peeling like sunburned skin, and the hallway smelled of cabbage, damp plaster, and 20 years of cheap tobacco. We didn't use the stairs. We found the ground floor corner room Evelyn had marked for us, right next to the alley exit. Joe stood to the side of the jam, his hand flat against the pocket where his Smith & Wesson sat. I didn't bother with a polite tap. I took the door right at the latch with the heel of my wingtip. The cheap pine gave a loud, splintering crack and swung inward, banging hard against the plaster wall. We waited for the flash of a muzzle, the roar of a Saturday night special, or the frantic scramble of a cornered animal. Nothing came. The room was about the size of a shipping crate, suffocatingly hot from a gas heater that was hissing like a snake in the corner. Sunk into a saggy mattress, under a threadbare wool blanket, was Frederick Sinclair. He didn't look like a high-stakes rogue dealer who had just hijacked a piece of European history. He looked like a stiff with a pulse. His skin was the color of skim milk. His shirt was stiff with old sweat, and his left arm was turned up, showing the fresh, angry red tracks near the crook of his elbow. A burnt spoon and a glass syringe sat on the orange crate next to the bed. He was so far gone into the horse, he didn't even twitch when the door splinters hit the floorboards. His breathing was just a shallow, rattling wheeze. I let out a long breath and slowly lowered the .45, letting the hammer down with a soft click. Well, that was easy, I said to Joe. Joe just shrugged, his face expressionless as he stepped into the room. He didn't look relieved, he just looked disgusted. We didn't waste any time being gentle. Joe found a length of hemp clothesline in the communal closet down the hall, and we trussed Frederick up tight, wrists to ankles behind his back, the way they tie calves at the rodeo. He let out a wet groan when we hoisted him off the mattress, but his eyes never stayed open for more than a second. We carried him out through the alley door, the rain hitting our faces like cold needles, and bundled his limp, heavy frame straight into the cavernous trunk of the DeSoto. I slammed the heavy lid shut, the lock catching with a definitive metallic thud. Before I turned the key in the ignition, I stepped into the leaking wooden phone booth at the corner of 4th and Alameda. I dropped a nickel into the slot, waited for the dial tone, and dialed the office line. The ring didn't even finish before the receiver picked up. Morgan and Russo Detective Agency, Sarge's voice crackled through the wire, sharp and completely steady. It's Jack, I said, leaning my shoulder against the wet glass of the booth. We got the package. He wasn't in any condition to use that funnel his sister set up for us. We're rolling back to the boulevard now. And the lady? Sarge asked. Keep her right where she is, I told her, watching the wipers on the DeSoto trace their steady rhythm across the street. We're setting up a family reunion. Let's see how much her script holds up when her lead actor is sitting in the room. Understood, Sarge said. The door stays bolted till I hear your knock. The drive back across the basin was quiet, save for the steady hiss of the tires against the flooded asphalt and the occasional heavy thump from the trunk whenever we hit a pothole on the viaduct. By the time Joe and I dragged Frederick's dead weight up the narrow concrete stairs of the office, our coats were soaked through and our shoulders ached. He wasn't a big man, but a passed-out junkie has a way of turning into pure lead. We burst through the frosted glass door, Joe holding the boots and me holding the armpits, and dumped him right on the linoleum in front of the armchair. Evelyn Sinclair didn't scream, and she didn't jump out of her seat. She just looked down at the bruised, sweat-streaked face of her brother, her eyes narrowing into two thin slits of pure ice. If she felt any relief that the boy was still breathing, she hid it behind a wall of ungrateful, aristocratic spite. "You fools," she whispered, her voice low and venomous as she looked up at me. "You think you've solved something? You've just brought the butcher shop inside your own walls." "Shut up, Evelyn," I said, tossing my wet fedora onto the coat-tree and leaning back against the edge of my desk. The room went completely quiet again, but the pressure was building by the second. The immediate legwork was done, but the real headache was just beginning. We had the rogue dealer, we had his high-level Chicago handler, and we had the ledger. But we were holding a pair of hot wires in a very small room. Joe leaned against the filing cabinet, lighting a fresh cigarette, his eyes tracking the dark rain lashing against the glass. "All right, Jack. The reunion's a flop. What's the next move?" I looked down at the pair of them on the floor. Option 1, the Pandolini option. We load them back into the DeSoto and haul them straight down to the basement of the Pandolini mansion, the same cold concrete where Murphy took his final walk. The old man's dog face and handsome have tools that don't fit in a desk drawer, and they'll clear the grease out of Evelyn's wholesale ledger before the rain lets up. It gets the target off our office, but once they go into that cellar, they don't come out vertical. Option 2, the blockade option. We keep them right here under our own ceiling. We bolt the door, load our irons, and wait out the night. If the Castellano outfit figures out their funnel failed, then they're going to start checking every second-story window on the boulevard. Keeping them here gives us total control over the information, but it means turning this office into a fortress and hoping the frosted glass holds up when the heavy wool coats start showing up with Tommy guns. I looked at Joe, then over at Sarge, whose hand was resting entirely too close to the desk drawer where she'd stashed the nickel-plated .38. "Which way do we point the wheels, Joe?" I murmured. The room went so quiet you could hear the ash from Joe's cigarette hit the floor. Paulie didn't make a sound, but his hand went dead still against his belt line. Sarge didn't blink. She just shifted her weight slightly, her shadow cutting a long, hard line across the linoleum, keeping herself between Evelyn and the desk drawer. They knew me. They knew I didn't make threats just to hear the sound of my own teeth clicking. Evelyn Sinclair looked up from her brother's limp body. She stared straight into my eyes, looking for the bluff, looking for that soft, chivalrous streak she thought every West Coast dick carried like a badge. She didn't find it. "Or, and as thin as my patience is wearing, there is a third option," I said, looking right in her eyes. "Tell us the whole operation or I kill you, and this fucking junkie right here in this office. What's it gonna be?" The radiator let out one sharp metallic clank, and the sound seemed to snap the last string holding her together. The arrogant, icy glare she'd been wearing since Sarge threw her down finally cracked. Her shoulders dropped an inch, the silk trench coat collapsing around her like a deflated tent. She knew if I squeezed the trigger, nobody on the pavement would even care. 2 more bodies in a city that was already bleeding from a dozen different corners. "The ledger," she whispered, her voice so thin it barely carried over the sound of the rain. "The black ledger on the floor. That's the whole operation." Joe didn't wait for an invite. He stepped over the junkie, reached down by the filing cabinet, and picked up the oilskin book. He flipped it open with his thumb, the crisp rustle of the paper loud in the silence. "It ain't just delivery weights, Jack," Joe said, his eyes tracking the ink columns. He leaned down under the desk lamp, the yellow light catching the hard angles of his face. "It's names. Drop points at the San Pedro fruit piers, warehouse leases in Glendale, and 3 different freight captains on the Santa Fe line who are taking envelopes to look the other way when the crates come off the trucks." "The Castellanos didn't just send a tribute," I murmured, my eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. "They bought the infrastructure. They built a pipeline right under Pandolini's nose. They're moving the main office here. Evelyn confessed, her voice shaking now, the real fear finally bubbling to the surface. Chicago's getting too hot. The feds are tapping the wires back east. The old man in Chicago, Castellano himself, ordered the move 3 months ago. Frederick was just the local clerk they hired to sign the lease papers because he had a clean record and a habit that kept him on a leash. She reached out, her gloved fingers trembling as she touched her brother's damp shoulder. He wasn't trying to buy his way out of the syndicate when he took the cross, Mr. Morgan. He was trying to buy me out. He found out they were going to use me as the front for the new club on Sunset, the one they're using to wash the heroin money. He knew what happened to the last girl who held the liquor license for them in Detroit. He panicked. He thought if he took the tribute, the whole expansion would stall, and we could run. I let out a slow, heavy breath, the anger in my gut cooling down into something hard and useful. The math finally added up. The funnel wasn't just a trap to get Joe and I killed. It was a desperate gamble to clean up a mess before the Chi-Town cocksuckers realized the local hired help had ruined the biggest expansion on the Pacific coast. I looked over at Joe. He had the oilskin ledger tucked flat against his chest. "This book is the playbook for the whole invasion," Joe said, a grim, tight smile touching his lips. "If Pandolini gets his hands on this alongside that cross, the Castellano crew won't just be out a tribute. They're going to lose every dime they've invested in California before the war even starts." I looked back down at Evelyn. She was watching me like a prisoner waiting for the trapdoor to drop. "You're going to stay in that chair, Miss Sinclair," I told her, my voice low and flat. "And your brother's going to stay right there on the floor until he cooks the shit out of his system. We aren't killing you. Not yet. Because right now, you two are the only witnesses who can verify every name in that book." I turned to the front desk. "Sarge, get the line open to Pandolini's house. Tell him we don't just have the rogue dealer. We have the deed to Chicago's new house, and it's time to start the eviction." Chapter 5. "Keep him on the wire, Sarge," I said, stepping around Frederick's twitchy, breathing form on the linoleum. I took the heavy black receiver from her hand. The earpiece was cold against my jaw, and the line carried that hollow, distant hum you only get on the private, unlisted exchanges. "Don Pandolini," I said into the mouthpiece, keeping my voice level, low, and clear of the static. "It's Jack." There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind of silence that usually cost a man a lot of money or a lot of skin. Then came the old man's voice, thick and slow like molasses traveling through a pipe. "Jack," Pandolini rumbled. "Dog face and handsome just walked through my gate. They brought me a piece of old church gold with a very ugly history attached to it. They tell me it came from your desk." "The cross is just the wrapper, Don Pandolini," I said, leaning my elbow against the oak partition of Sarge's desk. "We just dragged the real package back to the office. The junkie clerk, Frederick Sinclair, and his sister, Evelyn. They set a trap for Joe and me down at the 4th Street railyards, looking to turn us into chalk outlines so they could skip town with your leverage." I looked over at Joe. He held up the black oilskin ledger, tilting it under the amber glow of the desk lamp so I could see the ink columns again. "But the script went sour," I continued into the mouthpiece. "We've got them both right here. More importantly, we have a black ledger that's spilled out of the lady's purse. It isn't a list of delivery weights, Don Pandolini. It's the entire blueprint for Chicago's expansion into the basin. Warehouses in Glendale, drop points at the San Pedro fruit piers, and 3 Santa Fe freight captains who have been taking envelopes to look the other way since the winter." The line went dead silent again. I could hear the rhythmic clack-clank of our office radiator and the heavy, wet breathing of the junkie on the floor. But on Pandolini's end, the air had gone completely still. He wasn't just listening anymore. He was calculating the size of the grave he was going to have to dig for the Castellano family's ambitions. "They bought the pipeline right under your feet," I said flatly. "They're planning on moving their main office here because the feds are tapping the wires back east. The junkie and his sister are the only living witnesses who can verify every name and signature in this book. Bring them to the house, Jack, Pandolini said, his voice dropping into that quiet, chilling register that usually preceded a funeral. No, I cut in, my teeth clicking shut on the word. I looked out the frosted glass door at the dark, rain-swept stretch of the boulevard. The east side is already crawling. If we bundle these two back into the DeSoto, we're driving a target through 3 miles of open asphalt. We stay put. I gripped the receiver tighter. Please come here, Don Pandolini. Bring Dogface and Handsome and come to the office. I want you to hear everything personally, straight from the sister's mouth, before the lead starts flying on the boulevard. There was a long, heavy breath on the wire, followed by the dry, paper-thin rustle of the old man shifting his weight in his leather chair. 10 minutes, Jack, Pandolini said. Tell Sarge to leave the alley lock unbolted. The line went dead with a sharp, heavy click. I handed the receiver back to Sarge. She didn't need to be told twice. She stood up, smoothed down the front of her skirt, and walked toward the back door to clear the latch. I turned back to the room, my hand resting loose and heavy above my holster. He's coming here, I told Joe. Get the lady a fresh cigarette, Polly. She's going to need her voice operational by the time the Don walks through that door. The 10 minutes stretched out like chewing gum on a hot sidewalk. Polly's hand was shaking so bad, the match flared twice before he could catch the tip of Evelyn's cigarette. She took a long, desperate drag, her flinty eyes tracking the smoke as it drifted up toward the ceiling fan. On the floor, Frederick let out a low, ragged moan, his boots dragging a dry screech across the linoleum as his knees buckled against the twine. Then the rear alley door groaned. The latch clicked back with a heavy, oiled precision, and the damp chill of the Los Angeles night rolled into the back room. Don Pandolini stepped into the office first. He didn't look like a man who had rushed across the basin in a downpour. His heavy wool overcoat was pristine, and his silk tie was knotted perfectly at his collar. Behind him came Handsome, carrying a dripping black umbrella, and Dogface, whose massive shoulders easily filled the entire width of the hallway frame. Frederick's eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitching against the floorboards as the white fog of the horse finally began to clear out of his head. He rolled onto his side, blinking up at the ceiling lamps, his eyes widening as the 3 shadows blocked out the light. Don Pandolini, I said, nodding toward the center of the room. The old man didn't look at me yet. His eyes went straight to the linoleum, taking in the shivering junkie, before drifting up to Evelyn, who sat rigid in the armchair, her knuckles white against the leather. You have a very messy floor, Jack, Pandolini rumbled, his voice low and dry as wood smoke. He unbuttoned his overcoat, allowing Handsome to take it from his shoulders. We can clean it up later, I said, leaning back against the desk. Joe's holding the ledger. It lays out the whole pipeline, the fruit piers, the Glendale leases, the freight captains. But these two are the ones who can verify the signatures. Chicago's using the brother to sign the ink because his record is clean. Pandolini walked over to the desk, his heavy leather shoes clicking rhythmically. He leaned his palms on the edge of the wood, looking down at Frederick as the junkie finally scrambled into a sitting position, his boots slipping on his own sweat. Who? Frederick croaked, his voice thick and wet. He looked at Dogface, then at Handsome, the reality of the room finally piercing through the remaining haze. Evelyn, what is this? Who are these guys? Evelyn didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the rain hammering the window. Shut up, Fred, she whispered. Pandolini turned his head slightly, giving Handsome a single, microtonal nod. Handsome stepped forward, his expression perfectly pleasant, almost cordial. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean, monogrammed handkerchief, slowly wrapping it around his right knuckles. The Don likes a complete narrative, Mr. Sinclair, Handsome said, his voice smooth as silk. We have the Antwerp cross, and we have the Black Book. What we need from you and your sister are the names of the Chicago handlers currently sitting in those Glendale warehouses. We want the office addresses on Sunset. I don't know anything, Frederick panicked. I just signed the papers. They give me the capsules. I sign the ink. That's it. I swear to God, that's it. Dogface moved then. He didn't use a weapon. He just stepped into the space, his massive hand coming down like a vice on Frederick's collarbone, pinning him flat against the floorboards with enough pressure to make the junkie's breath leave him in a sharp, wet wheeze. We are looking to settle this without turning the boulevard into a shooting gallery, young man, Don Pandolini said, looking down at the brother and sister with the cold detachment of a judge reading an eviction notice. An all-out war with Chicago is bad for the local markets. It brings the feds and it closes the ports. If I have the exact names of their operational heads tonight, I can squeeze them out of the basin before they even have a chance to draw their irons. The old man looked up, his eyes locking onto Evelyn, cutting right through the last of her cigarette smoke. You can speak for him, young lady. Or we can let Dogface find out how much pressure your brother's ribs can take before they stop holding air. If you want to leave this room vertical, you give me the names of the men who sent that tribute. Choose quickly. The room went dead silent, save for the wet, terrified panting of Frederick Sinclair flat against the floorboards. Dogface didn't hesitate. With his left hand still pinning the junkie's collarbone like an iron anvil, his right hand reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled his snub-nosed revolver. The steel made a sharp, heavy clack as he pressed the short barrel directly into the soft flesh right beneath Frederick's ear. The pressure forced the junkie's head sideways, his eyes rolling back in pure, unadulterated terror. Please, Evelyn, please, Frederick sputtered, a string of bloody saliva leaking from the corner of his mouth onto the linoleum. Tell him, just tell him. Handsome stepped closer to the armchair, leaning down slightly so he was right in Evelyn's field of vision. The pleasant, cordial front he'd been wearing since he walked through the door didn't just fade. It twisted into a sharp, devious grin that showed too many teeth. Unless you want your brother's brains blown all over you, I suggest you start talking, Handsome said, his voice dropping into a smooth, terrifying purr, because we would think nothing of blasting a worthless junkie to hell. Evelyn didn't move a muscle, but the remaining ash on her cigarette finally broke, scattering across the silk fabric of her trench coat. She looked at Handsome's grin, then down at the heavy, scarred hand of Dogface holding the iron against her brother's skull. She knew the machinery of the Pandolini family wasn't a bluff. To them, a rogue, out-of-town pusher wasn't a life. It was just a stain that needed to be scrubbed off the pavement before the morning shift started. I kept my back against the desk, my arms crossed, watching her face in the amber glare of the lamp. Joe didn't move either, his fingers still resting on the edge of the oilskin ledger. We needed those names to stop the Chicago invasion before the Tommy guns started rattling on the boulevard, and Evelyn was running out of seconds on the clock. All right, she suddenly gasped, the icy composure finally shattering into a ragged, desperate breath. She slammed her eyes shut, unable to look at the revolver pressed into Fred's head. All right, the man running the Glendale manifests, his name is Albee, Thomas Albee. He handles the trucks coming out of Section 4. Don Pandolini didn't move an inch, his palm still flat on the mahogany desk, his eyes drinking in the admission like a judge recording a verdict. Go on, young lady, the old man rumbled. The office is on Sunset. Give me the rest of it. The dam didn't just crack, it burst wide open. Evelyn sat shaking in the armchair, her voice trembling as the words tumbled out of her, in a desperate, frantic rush to keep Dogface's finger off the trigger. The Sunset office is a front under the name Pacific Horizon Imports, she choked out, her fingers digging through the leather of her armchair. The keys are in the lining of my purse. The man sitting there is Marconi. Vince Marconi. He's Castellano's nephew. He's the one holding the bank drafts to clear the dock leases. The freight captains. They meet him at the diner on 5th Street every Thursday at midnight to collect their envelopes. Joe's pencil was flying across the margins of the oilskin ledger, scratching down the names and locations with a hard, definitive scrape. Thomas Albee. Vince Marconi. Pacific Horizon Imports. The whole skeleton of Chicago's West Coast empire was being laid bare under our amber desk lamp. When she finally ran out of breath, the office fell back into that heavy, suffocating silence. Frederick was weeping softly into the linoleum, his chest heaving against the floorboards, while Dogface kept the snub-nosed barrel pressed tight behind his ear. Don Pandolini slowly stood up straight, lifting his palms from the desk. He didn't look at the junkie, and he didn't look at the ledger. He stepped around the corner of the wood until he was standing directly over Evelyn, his heavy shadow completely blotting out the red neon glare from the street. "If you want to live, we can protect you," Pandolini said to Evelyn, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly quiet register that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "But if this is another trap, like you tried to set for Jack and Joe, I will personally cut you into little pieces and feed you to fucking stray dogs of the city." He stood perfectly still, looking down at her through his heavy lids. And there wasn't a soul in that room who doubted him. The old man meant every single word. Evelyn looked up into his cold, wrinkled face and slowly, mutely, nodded her head. The finishing school girl, the syndicate hustler, the calculating femme fatale, they were all buried under the raw, unadulterated fear of the local law. Pandolini turned his head slightly, his gaze flicking over to Joe and me. "We have the names, Jack. We have the ledger. Now we close the border before Chicago even realizes the gate is locked." The old man's words hung in the air, thick and permanent, outlasting the faint, fading hiss of the radiator. Pandolini reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick linen handkerchief, and slowly wiped a stray drop of alley rain from the back of his hand. He looked down at the oilskin book Joe was holding, then back to me. The weight of his presence seemed to push the walls of our little second-story office closer together. "The freight captains are the key, Jack," Pandolini murmured, his tone shifting back to that cold executive drone. "Without the rails, Chicago's pipeline is nothing but empty pipe. Handsome, take 2 boys and get down to that diner on 5th Street. I want those captains met before Thursday. Tell them their envelopes come from the basin now, or they don't leave the yards alive." "Consider it done, Don Pandolini," Handsome said, his devious grin vanishing, replaced by the smooth, mechanical efficiency of a top-tier operator. He stepped back toward the alley door, tapping his dripping umbrella against the threshold. "And Dogface," the old man added, his eyes drifting back to the floor. "Get this garbage off Jack's linoleum. Put them in the back of the Buick. They stay under watch at the house until my people clear out the Sunset office. If Marconi's people smell a rat, these 2 are our insurance." Dogface gave a single, tight nod. He reloaded his snub-nosed iron into his coat jacket, reached down with his massive hands, and hoisted Frederick up by his bound collarbone like a sack of laundry. The junkie let out one last exhausted whine as his boots scraped out the door. Evelyn stood up slowly, her knees visibly shaking under her ruined silk trench coat, and walked out ahead of the giant without looking back. The door clicked shut, and the heavy shadow of the street finally left the room. Joe let out a long, ragged breath, tossing his pencil onto the desk blotter before sliding the oilskin ledger into his interior pocket. "Well," he muttered, rubbing his eyes, "that's one way to keep the peace. The feds won't like it, but the pavement stays local." I walked over to the window, looking through the frosted glass as the heavy black sedan pulled away from the curb down below, its taillights bleeding a long, wet red streak into the LA dark. The rain was finally starting to let up, leaving nothing but the steady, monotonous drip from the gutters. "It's a clean eviction, Joe," I said softly, my hand finding the cold walnut grip of the .45 still resting safely in its leather. "For now." Sarge's typewriter suddenly let out a sharp ding, return, zing. The relentless clack, clack, clack started up again in perfect military intervals. a reminder that the city outside never truly stops spinning. On top of the radiator, Hammett stretched out his black legs, gave a long aristocratic yawn, and settled right back into his fur. The morning was gone, the coffee was cold, but the office was still standing. Chapter 6. The heavy black Buick had long since vanished into the damp gloom of the boulevard. Joe stood by the filing cabinet, methodically sliding the black oilskin ledger into his breast pocket like a man tucking away a deed to a gold mine. "You look beat, Jack," Joe said, his eyes tracking me as I rubbed the bridge of my nose. "I'm fine," I muttered, though my shoulder blades felt like they'd been hammered into the plaster. Then my eyes hit the metal lunch tin sitting on the corner of my desk. The ham and rye Rose had packed for me. The tin was completely untouched. The knot in my gut tightened, and it wasn't from hunger. Damn it, I told Rose I'd be down at the counter by noon. She's probably been watching the door between every order. Joe blew a short stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Go on down there. Polly and I can take my car and nose around that 5th Street diner where the freight captains do their business. We'll keep our eyes peeled and our irons low." Polly sat up straight on the couch, his chest inflating beneath his damp lapels. The domestic terror of the mason jars seemed to evaporate the second he was given an actual assignment. "You hear that, Jack? We are on the march. Don't you worry about a thing. Joe and I will handle the recon." I looked at Joe, then at Polly, who was already checking his holster with a brand-new short-lived bravado. "Just don't start any fireworks, Polly," I warned, grabbing my fedora from the tree. "We just got the borders closed. Don't go reopening them because you want to look tough in front of a freight captain." "Sarge," I nodded toward the front desk, "we're clearing out. You want me to lock the street door from the outside?" Sarge didn't look up from her keys, her fingers already restarting that steady military rhythm, clack, clack, clack. Return. Zing. "Leave it, Jack. I have 3 hours of land registry summaries to cross-reference before the courthouse closes tomorrow. Just tell Rose she owes me a slice of that cherry pie. I'm going to have to ask her how to make that crust." "You got it," I said. I stepped out into the hallway, the frosted glass door clicking shut behind us. The rain had finally dwindled to a thin, greasy mist that made the neon lights of the boulevard smear across the wet asphalt like fresh paint. The bell above the door of Rose's diner gave a soft, familiar ting as I pushed through the glass. The air inside was an entirely different country, warm, thick with the heavy, sweet perfume of griddle grease, burnt sugar, and the deep, rich roast of premium coffee beans. It was the only place in Los Angeles that didn't feel like it was waiting for a body to drop. Rose was behind the counter, wiping down the countertop with a white rag. When the bell rang, her shoulders squared slightly, but the second her eyes found my face under the brim of my hat, the tension melted right out of her. "Look what the storm washed in," she said, her voice low and warm, carrying that quiet, steady cadence that always managed to slow my pulse down. "I'm late," I said, sliding onto the corner stool near the register, the vinyl giving a soft hiss beneath my weight. "I'm sorry, Rose. The shit went sideways about 10 minutes after I got to the office this morning." She didn't ask for any details, and I didn't offer them. She didn't need to know about out-of-town muscle, or ancient gold crosses, or the fact that Don Pandolini had just cleared a mess off my floor. She just set her rag down, reached for a heavy ceramic mug, and poured it full of black coffee so hot the steam hit my chin. She slid it across the counter, then reached over, her warm, small hand covering my knuckles. Her skin was soft, smelling faintly of vanilla and dish soap, a clean, perfect shield against the rot of the streets. "You're breathing, Jack," she whispered, her thumb tracing the back of my hand. "That's the only part I care about. Things are going to be a little twitchy on the boulevard for the next couple of days," I said softly, taking a sip of the coffee. It was smooth, nothing like the paint stripper Sarge brewed to keep her awake. Just routine business, but it's got the neighborhood on edge. I just wanted to see you and to tell you to keep the back door bolted after dark. Rose looked at me through her thick lashes, her dark eyes steady and completely devoid of panic. She'd been a private eyes girl long enough to know how the pavement worked. She didn't press for names or stories. She just held my hand firm, letting her warmth seep into my cold fingers. "I can handle the back door, Jack," she said softly, her lips curving into a small, quiet smile. "You just make sure you're the one knocking on it when the lights go out." We sat there in the quiet of the counter for 5 minutes, not saying another word. The diner was empty, the pie cases were full, and for those 5 minutes, the city outside didn't exist. There was just the heat of the mug, the smell of the roast, and the steady, quiet rhythm of her breathing across the wood. It was the only medicine I needed. I squeezed her fingers once, drained the rest of the mug, and stood up, pulling my hat down low. "Sarge says you owe her a slice of cherry." "Tell her she gets the whole pie if she keeps you out of the morgue," Rose said, her eyes tracking me all the way back to the door. The stairs leading up to the office felt longer on the way back. The mist had turned into a cold, clinging fog that hung in the corners of the concrete well, thick with the stench of old brick. When I reached the second floor, my hand instinctively dropped beneath the shadow of my coat, my fingers wrapping around the walnut grip of the 45. The hallway was too quiet. The steady, relentless clack, clack, clack of Sarge's typewriter wasn't bouncing off the walls. The silence was absolute, the kind of stillness that usually meant someone was holding their breath or waiting for a trigger to trip. I eased the door open, the brass doorknob turning without a sound. The smell hit me first. It wasn't radiator steam or cheap floor wax anymore. It was the sharp, ozone burn of fresh cordite and the heavy, sweet stench of opened veins. Lying flat on his back in the center of the linoleum, right where Frederick Sinclair had been shivering earlier, was a man I'd never seen before. He was wearing a heavy wool overcoat that smelled faintly of coal smoke and diesel, the fabric torn open at the chest where 3 dark, wet, purple holes had been punched straight through the wool. A cheap Saturday night special had rolled out of his dying grip, its barrel pointing uselessly toward the filing cabinets. Sitting perfectly erect behind her desk, her spine a straight line of uncompromising whack discipline, was Sarge. Her civilian blouse was immaculate, not a single thread out of place. Her hands were resting lightly on the home row of her keys, but her drawer was wide open. Sitting right next to her shorthand notepad was the nickel-plated .38 we'd confiscated from Evelyn Sinclair earlier that morning. On top of the radiator, Hammett blinked his green eyes once, completely indifferent to the corpse on the floor, before burying his black nose back into his fur. I let out a slow breath, letting the hammer of my 45 down with a soft click as I stepped over the dead man's wingtips. "Chicago?" I asked flatly. "He didn't introduce himself," Sarge said, her voice as level and dry as the desert highway. She didn't look at the body, and she didn't look at the blood pooling near the desk legs. "He came through the front door with his iron out, asking where the Belgian freight was hidden. I told him he had the wrong office." She turned her eyes toward me, her gaze as cold and level as a pair of gun barrels. "He didn't want to listen, Jack. So I shot the bastard." I had just finished wrapping the dead man's ankles in an old canvas dropcloth from the supply closet when the front latch clicked. Joe walked in first, his hat tilted back, followed by Paulie, who was adjusting his lapels like he'd just personally secured the perimeter of the entire east side. They both stopped short, their eyes dropping to the dark, heavy bundle sitting in the middle of the linoleum and the faint pink smudge where the mop hadn't quite finished its work. Joe looked at the dropcloth, then up at me, a slow, wry grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm glad to see things are getting back to normal around here," he joked, tossing his car keys onto the corner desk. Paulie crossed his arms, looking down at the canvas with a theatrical pout. "You send us out so you can have all the fun. I see how it is." "It wasn't my kill," I said, leaning the handle of the mop against the wall and nodding over toward the front desk. Paulie's eyes went wide as he turned to look at Sarge. She was already back to her typing, her fingers moving with that same relentless, unbothered precision, though the nickel-plated .38 was still sitting face up on her blotter. Paulie let out a low whistle, stepping closer to inspect the 3 neat, tight holes punched through the chest of the man on the floor. "Good grouping, Sarge." Sarge didn't miss a beat. She hit the carriage return with a sharp, metallic zing and looked up, a rare, razor-thin smirk of pure pride touching her lips. "Top marksman of my graduating class. Remind me never to misplace my time cards," Joe muttered, pulling a fresh cigarette from his pack. His face went serious then, the humor evaporating as he walked over to my desk and leaned against the edge, looking out the frosted glass. "We didn't find any freight captains at the diner, Jack, but we found something else." I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped up beside him. "What did you see?" Joe took a long drag, his eyes tracking the smoke as it hit the lamp glow. "Chicago's already putting their boots on the pavement. We nosed around the perimeter of Section 4 near the railyards. They aren't waiting for Thursday, Jack. Thomas Albee, the guy Evelyn named, he's already got 4 heavy flatbeds backed up to the Glendale manifests, and they're moving crates under the cover of the fog. Guys with Tommy guns are standing watch on the catwalks." He looked back at me, his voice dropping low. "They're draining the warehouses tonight. If Pandolini doesn't move his boys into those yards, Chicago's going to have their entire inventory scattered across 3 different hidden distribution points before the sun comes up. We'll be chasing ghosts by morning." I grabbed the heavy black receiver before the dial could even settle. My fingers were slick with the grease from the canvas dropcloth, and my heart was hammering a hard, fast rhythm against my ribs. I didn't wait for the operators to play their games. I gave them the private exchange, and the line connected with that same hollow, cold hum. "Pandolini," the old man's voice rumbled on the first ring. "It's Jack," I said, my voice cutting through the line like a hacksaw. "The plan just went out the window. Chicago isn't waiting for the Thursday envelopes. Joe and Paulie just got back from the Glendale manifests. Thomas Albee is moving the crates out of Section 4 tonight, under the cover of the fog. They're draining the warehouses." The silence on the other end was brief, but it was heavy enough to crack pavement. "How many?" Pandolini asked, his voice dropping into that quiet, executive freeze. "4 flatbeds already backed up to the platforms," I said, looking over at Joe, who gave me a sharp nod. "But that's the small part. They're heavily armed. Joe spotted Tommy guns on the catwalks. If you don't make a move tonight, their entire inventory is going underground. By morning, Chicago will have 100 blind distribution points across the basin, and we'll be fighting a fucking war in our own backyard." "They're drawing their irons early," Pandolini murmured, more to himself than to me. "They think the fog will keep the local law in their holes? Send everyone you have," I said flatly, my knuckles turning white against the plastic mouthpiece. "Every button, every shooter, every car that can carry lead. We need to cap Section 4 before those flatbeds hit the highway." "The gates are already opening, Jack," the old man rumbled. "Dogface and Handsome are putting the boys in the cars. We will meet you at the eastern approach of the rail yard." "We'll be there," I said. "We send them back to Chicago tonight." "Don't get killed on my time, Jack," Pandolini said, and the line went dead with a heavy, definitive click. I slammed the receiver down and turned back to the room. The air in the office had completely changed. The humor was gone. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by the cold, metallic electricity that always comes right before the firing pin drops. Joe was already at the locker, pulling out 2 extra boxes of .45 ammunition and tossing one to Paulie. Paulie caught it against his chest, his eyes bright, his teeth gritted. "Sarge," I said, checking my iron one last time, before sliding it deep into the leather beneath my coat. "Lock the door behind us. If anyone else tries to come in here, you know what to do." Sarge didn't look up from her notepad, her fountain pen already scratching out the log of the night's events. "The drawer's still open, Jack. Don't worry about the office, just don't die. I want that cherry pie." "Come on," I told Joe and Paulie, throwing open the frosted glass door. "Handsome and Dogface are already rolling, and Chicago's waiting for us in the fog. Chapter 7. The fog didn't just drift into the Section 4 railyards. It swam through the iron chassis of the boxcars, thick as cold grease and smelling of sulfur. The headlights of the DeSoto cut two yellow, vibrating tunnels through the gray mist as I pulled up to the western switch shacks. To the east, three heavy black Cadillacs rolled out of the dark without their running lights on. Their doors swung open in perfect military unison. Dogface stepped into the vapor first, his massive trench coat billowing behind him like a funeral shroud, a heavy Tommy gun cradled in his arm like a child. Beside him, Handsome was already moving, his pleasant grin entirely gone, his fingers snapping the bolt back on a high-caliber Winchester rifle. "Check your irons," I told Joe and Polly, killing the ignition. The engine died with a hot, ticking sigh. When the music starts, you don't stop dancing until the floor is empty. We didn't even make it to the first loading platform before the night tore wide open. A muzzle flash, bright orange and violent, split the fog from the top of a Santa Fe refrigerator car. The heavy thud, thud, thud of a Chicago typewriter began to saw through the dark, the copper-jacketed slugs ripping through the wooden shacks, showering us in a storm of yellow splinters. "Down!" Joe roared, his .45 already barking into the mist. The firefight wasn't a skirmish. It was an operatic slaughterhouse. The rail yard became a labyrinth of fire and screaming iron. The local boys and the Chicago outfits slammed into each other between the tracks, the roar of the shotguns bouncing off the steel hulls of the freight trains until the noise was loud enough to make your ears bleed. Bodies were falling everywhere, dropping into the gravel like sacks of coal. I saw one of Pandolini's men take a burst to the chest, his body spinning like a top, before slamming face first into a switch lever. From the catwalks above, Handsome's Winchester cracked with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Each report followed by the heavy, wet thud of a Chicago scout plunging off the iron ladders into the dark below. Paulie was crouched behind a wheel assembly, his face tight, his teeth bared as he emptied his iron into the fog with the cold, practiced discipline of a man who had survived the mud back in Europe. He and Joe were trading sectors of fire without even needing to speak, covering each other's reloads in perfect sync. I was advancing along the flank of a boxcar, my .45 kicking against my palm as I dropped a shooter coming around the brake wheel when a sharp, metallic ping-clack echoed too close to my head. "Jack!" Joe screamed. He tried to pivot, his iron coming up to cover my blind spot, but a stray slug from the fog caught him clean in the thigh. The impact sounded like a wet towel hitting a butcher's block. Joe gasped, his leg buckling instantly under him, his frame crashing hard into the iron tie rods beneath the car. "Joe!" I lunged through the smoke, my boots sliding through gravel slick with fresh blood. Another burst of automatic fire stitched a neat line of holes across the wooden slats right above our heads. Paulie instantly laid down a heavy wall of suppressive fire to buy me time, his .45 barking rhythmically against the metal tracks. I grabbed Joe by the collar of his overcoat, my muscles screaming as I dragged his heavy form backward, scraping him through the dirt into the deep, dark shadow of a concrete loading dock. "Son of a bitch," Joe wheezed, his knuckles white as he clamped both hands over his thigh. Dark purple blood was already bubbling through his fingers, staining his trousers. "Son of a bitch, Jack. That's smarts." "Shut up and keep your hand on it," I growled, ripping my handkerchief out and stuffing it directly into the tear in his wool. "You lay low right here. Don't you move an inch until I can get you to a hospital. You hear me?" Joe's eyes were glassy under the amber glow of a distant yard lamp, but he gave a tight, ragged nod, his fingers tightening around the grip of his empty iron. "Go finish it," he whispered. I stood up, the heat in my chest burning through the exhaustion. Paulie fell in right at my shoulder, fresh magazine already snapped into his piece, his face grimly focused as we pushed toward the final warehouse line. The smoke was finally beginning to clear, lifting just enough to reveal the wreckage. The Chicago line had broken. A dozen bodies lay scattered across the switches, their overcoats soaking up the greasy puddle water. At the far end of the section, backed flat against the locked doors of the Glendale Manifest warehouse, was Thomas Albee. His Tommy gun was empty, its bolt locked back, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. Dogface stepped out of the fog, the barrel of his own weapon still smoking, the massive shadow of his frame completely swallowing the Chicago boss. He didn't shoot. He just leveled the cold iron right at Albee's nose. Don Pandolini walked up slow from the rear, his heavy wool overcoat still pristine, his hands buried deep in his pockets, as if he were merely inspecting a late-night delivery. "You have no business in Los Angeles, Mr. Albee," Dogface rumbled, his voice low and heavy as a shifting tectonic plate. "Clear out. Take what's left of your people and hit the rails back to the cornfields." Albee spit a mouthful of blood onto the gravel, his eyes darting frantically between Dogface and the old man. "You think we need your fucking port?" Albee gasped, his chest heaving. "Now we just want the cross. The Antwerp cross and the junkie thief that stole it from the vault. They belong to Chicago. You give us the gold and the kid, and we leave the West Coast tonight. We won't ever come back." Pandolini stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds, his heavy lids drifting down as he calculated the price of peace against the cost of a prolonged war. "The local market does not need another night like this," Pandolini said softly, his voice cutting through the distant hiss of a steam valve. He turned his head slightly toward one of his surviving soldiers. "Bring them!" From the back of the black sedan parked near the gate, 2 of Pandolini's boys dragged them out into the light of the yard lamps. Frederick Sinclair was shaking so hard his knees couldn't hold him, his face a gray mask of cold withdrawal. Evelyn walked behind him, her silk trench coat torn, her flinty eyes scanning the bodies on the ground with a desperate, calculating horror. One of the men carried the velvet bag containing the Antwerp cross. "A clean trade, Mr. Albee," Pandolini rumbled, nodding toward the shivering siblings. "The junkie, the sister, and the tribute. Your business in the basin is concluded." The men pushed Frederick and Evelyn forward into the neutral space between the 2 factions, just 10 feet from where Albee stood under Dogface's iron. But the script didn't hold. As Frederick stumbled over a rail, weeping softly, Evelyn didn't look at her brother. Her eyes locked onto a dead Chicago shooter lying in the dirt right at her feet. Before anyone could track the motion, she dropped like a hawk. Her fingers closed around the nickel-plated revolver sticking out of the dead man's coat pocket. "Evelyn," Frederick started to turn. Bang! The report was sharp, flat, and sudden. The slug caught Frederick right in the throat. His eyes went wide, a look of pure, unadulterated confusion crossing his face before he hit the gravel like a dropped stone, his blood pooling into the oil slicks between the ties. "Kill each other. I don't care. The cross is mine," Evelyn said coldly, her face twisted into something feral and wild. Before Dogface or Handsome could level their sights, she spun on her heel, her legs pumping as she sprinted straight into the dense black fog of the active rail yard, her silhouette vanishing instantly among the towering iron shadows of the moving freight cars. Before Evelyn could cover 20 yards of open gravel, the shadow of a towering Southern Pacific boxcar seemed to detach itself from the steel. A man stepped into the yellow aura of the switch lamp. It was Vince Marconi. His cashmere overcoat was unbuttoned, and his face was a mask of cold, unblinking calculation. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. He simply raised a heavy-frame Colt revolver, took a fraction of a second to track her silhouette through the mist, and pulled the trigger. The heavy slug caught Evelyn square in the back of the head. The sheer kinetic force of the lead spun her off her feet, her face instantly shattered and unrecognizable before she even hit the dirt. She dropped like a discarded rag doll, her stolen revolver clattering uselessly into the grease. The echo of the shot bounced off the iron undercarriages and died in the fog. Marcone walked over to her body with a slow, casual stride, his polished wingtips stepping cleanly around the expanding dark puddle. He bent down, his fingers dipping into the torn silk lining of her trench coat until they wrapped around the velvet pouch containing the Antwerp cross. He pulled it out, weighed it in his palm for a brief second, and slid it deep into his overcoat pocket. He stood up straight, holstered his iron beneath his lapel, and turned his face toward the gathering of local muscle. "Don Pandolini!" Marcone shouted, his voice carrying that sharp, arrogant Chicago cadence that cut right through the hiss of the steam valves. Pandolini didn't move an inch, his palms still buried deep in his pockets, his heavy lids narrowing into two dangerous slits. "A final word, Mr. Marcone, before my men cut you down?" "I wouldn't suggest that," Marcone called back, taking a few steps closer into the neutral zone, his hands held out wide to show they were empty. "Not unless you want your territory to become an absolute bloodbath. No, I offer something else. My family wishes to have a sit-down with you, to try to come up with an agreement on how we can conduct business here without stepping on your toes." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Dogface's finger was visibly tightening on the grip of his Tommy gun, just waiting for the old man to give the nod that would turn Marcone into Swiss cheese. "I will agree to a sit-down on one condition," Pandolini replied, his rumble low, dry, and absolute. "No weapons." "The family agrees," Marcone said, a small, knowing smirk touching his lips. "The boss is set to arrive in the morning. He is not happy about how fucked up things have gotten here tonight." 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Pandolini said flatly. "The office of the Morgan and Russo Detective Agency." My head snapped around so fast a muscle in my neck popped. Why the office, I thought, my mind racing through the tactical nightmare of it. Why not a neutral hotel conference room? A downtown restaurant? Why bring the entire high command of the Chicago outfit right to our front door? But I didn't have the time or the breath to argue the geometry of the sit-down. Under the concrete ledge of the loading dock, Joe let out another low, ragged groan, his hands slick with the dark, purple wealth of his own veins. "Paulie, grab his shoulders," I yelled, dropping to my knees in the dirt. "We need to get Joe to a hospital before he bleeds out right on the tracks." Chapter 8. The emergency room at St. Vincent's smelled of ether, carbolic acid, and the metallic tang of old blood. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, sickening note that vibrated straight through my skull. The doctors took Joe into surgery the second we rolled him through the double doors, his overcoat soaked completely through with the heavy purple wealth of his own blood. Paulie and I sat on a pair of wooden benches in the hallway for 3 grueling hours, watching the minute hand on the wall clock drag itself forward like a wounded soldier through mud. It was just past 3 in the morning when a surgeon in a stained white apron finally stepped into the corridor, wiping his hands on a towel. "He's a lucky man, Mr. Morgan," the doctor said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "The slug went clean through, centimeters to the left, and it would have torn the femoral artery wide open. He would have bled out on your floorboards before you could hit the ignition. As it stands, we patched the muscle and stopped the leak. He'll be okay, just off his feet for a few months." The weight in my chest didn't completely lift, but it shifted enough for me to draw a full breath. Once they moved Joe into a recovery ward on the 2nd floor, I sent Paulie down to the DeSoto to snatch a few hours of sleep. I walked into the quiet room alone. Joe was propped up against the pillows, his face the color of skim milk, but his eyes were sharp and clear under the amber glow of the bedside lamp. "You look like hell, Jack," he wheezed, his voice a dry rasp. "You're a fine one to talk," I said, pulling a metal chair up to the mattress. "Doctor says you're staying off that leg. No dancing for a while." Joe let out a weak, ragged chuckle, then braced his ribs. "The rail yard." Did the old man close the ledger? "Not yet," I said, leaning forward, dropping my voice, so it wouldn't carry past the privacy curtain. Marcone dropped Evelyn. Clean shot to the head. Blew her fucking brains out. He took the Antwerp cross right out of her coat pocket and lined up a truce with Pandolini. The big boss from Chicago's landing in the morning. They want to sit down. Joe's brow furrowed. Where? That's the part that's chewing a hole in my stomach, I muttered, rubbing the bridge of my nose. 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Pandolini set the geography right in our front room. The office of the Morgan and Russo Detective Agency. Joe stared at me, his knuckles tightening against the white hospital sheets. The office? Why the hell would he bring the entire Chicago High Command to our door? That's what I've been asking myself since we left the switches, I said, the frustration finally bubbling up. Pandolini set a strict condition for the meet, no weapons, and Chicago agreed to it. I'm sitting here wondering if the old man has finally lost his mind. He's walking right into a wolf den after disarming everyone. Joe didn't answer right away. He looked out the dark window toward the city skyline, his jaw working in a slow, rhythmic grind. I don't think he has lost his mind at all, Joe said softly. I blinked, looking at my partner. Why do you say that? Did he tell you no weapons? Joe asked, his eyes cutting back to me, sharp as two switchblades. No, I replied, the gears in my head stalling for a fraction of a second. No, he didn't. Why? A small, knowing smirk touched the corners of Joe's pale lips. He knows us well enough to know there are always guns within reach in that room. He didn't enforce the rule on our territory. He just used it to make sure Chicago walks through the front door clean. The realization hit me like a splash of ice water. The geometry of the office instantly flipped in my mind. The loose floorboard behind the water cooler, the double barrel taped beneath the knee hole of my oak desk, the steel filing cabinet where Sarge kept her spare stationery and her personal irons. A low, grim laugh escaped my throat. Son of a bitch, I whispered, shaking my head as the sheer brilliance of the trap fell into place. You're right. He knew damn well we'd be packing heat. Maybe the old man isn't crazy after all. Joe nodded against the pillow, his eyelids getting heavy as the morphine began to take its toll. Go get Sarge, Jack. Tell her to be ready for anything. I left the sterile white halls of St. Vincent's behind and stepped out into the damp, gray morning air. The fog was finally beginning to thin, rising off the black asphalt like steam from a hot iron. I woke Polly up from the front seat of the DeSoto. His face was lined with exhaustion, his jaw dark with a night's worth of stubble. Come on, pal, I said, rapping my knuckles against the window. No sense in heading into a high-stakes mafia summit on an empty stomach. Let's get some grub. The bell above the door of the diner gave its familiar, cheerful ping as we pushed our way inside. The air was thick with the beautiful, grounding scent of sizzling bacon and fresh-brewed Maxwell House. Rose was behind the counter, wiping down the laminated surface with a rag. The second her eyes met mine, she stopped. She took in the grease on my collar, Polly's rumpled suit, and the faint copper smell that always lingers after a bad night. Jack, she breathed, her voice dropping as she dropped the rag. You're whole. We're whole, Rosie, I said, as Polly and I slid onto our usual stools at the far corner of the counter. I didn't give her the gory details. She didn't need the mental picture of Evelyn Sinclair with her head blasted open and her brain spilling out on the railyard switches. But I told her the truth about the night. I told her about Chicago, the trap at Section 4, and exactly what happened to Joe. The color drained from her cheeks, her small hands coming up to clamp tightly over her apron. She was obviously upset, her chest heaving as she fought back the tears. She loved Joe like a big, stubborn brother. Oh, God, Joe, is he... He's going to be fine, Polly chimed in, his voice low but steady as he gave her a reassuring nod. The doctors patched him up clean, Rosie. The guy's too stubborn to die. He's resting at St. Vincent's, I added, reaching across the cool laminate to wrap my hand over hers. But he's going to be off his feet for a while. I'll go see him the second my shift ends, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I don't want any of you getting hurt anymore, Jack. This city is turning into an absolute slaughterhouse. I would appreciate it if you would, dear, I said softly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Then I let my voice drop into a serious, flat register. In fact, I do not want you anywhere near the office around 10 o'clock this morning." While Rose poured 2 steaming mugs of black coffee, I quickly explained the situation to her. I told her about Pandolini, Vince Marconi, and the No Weapons summit locked for the Morgan and Russo front room. "Promise me that you will be careful, Jack," she pleaded, her flinty eyes locking onto mine, then cutting over to Polly with a desperate heavy weight. "Please, both of you, just promise me." "I promise, we'll be fine," I assured her, forcing the kind of easy, confident smile that only a seasoned liar or a desperate detective can muster. Polly just offered a grim, quiet nod, taking a long sip of his coffee. She disappeared into the kitchen for a few minutes and came back with 2 heavy ceramic plates. She set down our ham and eggs, the yolks perfectly bright, the ham thick-cut and sizzling. But as she set down the silverware, I could still see the deep, unvarnished worry pooling in her eyes, no matter how much I tried to reassure her with a wink. She knew the underbelly of this city just as well as I did. We ate breakfast in quiet, rhythmic, mechanical bites, fueling the engine for what was coming. When I cleared my plate, I glanced up at the circular neon clock buzzing above the griddle. 8:30 a.m., that gave us exactly an hour and a half before the wolves were scheduled to knock on our frosted glass. It was time to go roll out the red carpet for our out-of-town guests. I pulled a few dollar bills from my pocket and slid them under the coffee saucer, standing up and adjusting the lapels of my overcoat while Paulie tossed down his napkin. "Jack, wait!" Rose called out before we could reach the door. She hurried back from the display case, holding a small cardboard bakery box tied with a white string. She set down the large piece of the homemade cherry pie our secretary had mentioned. "Here, bring this to Sarge," Rose said, her voice soft but steady. "Tell her to be careful as well. I know she's tough, but just keep her safe, Jack." I took the box, the cardboard warm against my palm. "I'll deliver the message, Rose. I love you, and I'll see you when this is all over." The bell chimed above us as Polly and I stepped back out into the morning chill, the weight of the upcoming hour sitting heavy on our shoulders. We climbed back into the DeSoto, the engine catching with a low growl. It was time to go see what kind of inventory Sarge had prepped for the morning. The tires of the DeSoto crunched against the wet curb outside the office building. The morning sun was a pale orange disk trying to burn through the smog as Polly and I climbed the creaking wooden stairs to the second floor. The gold leaf lettering on the frosted glass door still read Morgan and Russo Detective Agency, looking remarkably peaceful for a place about to host a den of wolves. Inside, the morning light was cutting through the Venetian blinds, painting yellow stripes across the floorboards. Sarge was already there, hanging her trench coat on the coat rack. She looked crisp, organized, and entirely removed from the bloodbath we'd spent the night wading through. "Morning, boss," she said, not looking up as she sorted the Daily Mail log. "You look like you went 10 rounds with a freight train." "Worse," I said, tossing the cardboard bakery box onto her desk blotter. "Rose sent you some cherry pie. She said to be careful." Sarge stopped, her eyes tracking from the box up to my face, then over to Polly's rumpled, gravel-stained suit. Her instincts kicked in instantly. "What happened?" "Sarge, roll out the red carpet." "We will have guests this morning," I said, leaning my palms flat against her desk. "Also, lock and load." She looked at me, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Lock and load? Jack, the rent's paid. Who's coming?" I gave her the lowdown, quick and cold. I told her about the rail yard, Evelyn killing her brother, then getting herself killed, and Joe taking a slug to the thigh. Her jaw tightened at the mention of Joe, a dangerous flicker crossing her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. I explained the 10 o'clock a.m. meeting with Pandolini, Vince Marconi, and the Chicago boss, and then I laid out Joe's no weapons theory from the hospital room. The confusion vanished from her face, replaced by the grim, unblinking discipline of a woman who had run logistics for the WACs. "The old man is a slippery bastard," she murmured. Without another word, Sarge reached down and slid her middle desk drawer wide open. She checked the cylinder of the nickel-plated .38 sitting right next to her carbon paper. 6 clean, copper-jacketed rounds gleamed back at her. She snapped it shut with a sharp, metallic clack. Then, she reached into her large leather handbag beneath the desk, checked her personal backup piece, and tucked it securely into the waistband of her skirt beneath her blazer. For the next 45 minutes, Paulie and I went to work on the geography of the room. We didn't talk. We just moved with the quiet efficiency of men preparing a bunker. Paulie slid a .32 automatic behind the cushions of the lobby couch. I pulled a short-barreled Colt Detective Special from the wall safe and taped it securely to the unfinished underside of my oak desk, right where my right knee would rest. We dropped an extra box of 45 shells behind the water cooler and checked the spring on the drawer of the steel filing cabinet. We made sure that no matter where we stood in that room, a gun was within arm's reach, in case things went completely off the rails. By the time we finished, the clock on the wall read 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes to spare. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the smell of gun oil, typewriter ribbon, and stale coffee. "Everybody relax," I said, walking to the center of the room and adjusting my necktie in the reflection of the glass door. No fast movements when they walk through that door. They are already going to be jumpy, and a jumpy bastard pulls triggers. Let's attempt, if at all possible, to not turn the office into Swiss cheese. "I just waxed these floors on Friday, Jack," Sarge said dryly, though her fingers were resting lightly near her desk drawer. "I'd appreciate it if we didn't bleed on them." 15 minutes left, almost showtime. The silence was deafening, so Sarge broke it the only way she knew how. She fed a clean sheet of white bond paper into her Underwood typewriter, set the margins, and started typing away. The steady, rhythmic clack, clack, clack ding filled the office, making it sound like any regular, boring Monday morning on the boulevard. Paulie stretched out on the leather couch, crossing his legs at the ankles. He pulled his fedora down over his eyes, leaning his head back against the cushion, pretending to be catching a casual nap. But I could see his right hand resting loose and ready just inches from the couch cushions. I walked into my private inner office, sat back in my squeaking leather chair, and unfolded the morning edition of the Los Angeles Times. I held it up high, pretending to read the front page headlines. But my eyes were locked on the frosted glass of the entrance door, watching for the shadows to fall across the gold lettering. The minutes dragged. The typewriter clacked. The city hummed outside the window. "May God have mercy on our souls," I muttered to the empty room, and waited for the door to open. Chapter 9. The frosted glass door didn't rattle until exactly 9:50 a.m. The silhouette that filled the frame was wide enough to block out the hallway light. Dogface pushed the door open, his heavy boots making no sound against Sarge's freshly waxed floor. He didn't say a word. He just stepped to the left of the hat rack, his cold eyes scanning the corners of the ceiling like an engineer looking for structural flaws. Behind him came Handsome, sporting that same pleasant, terrifyingly neutral grin, followed by Don Pandolini and two of his low-level guys. "Mr. Morgan," Pandolini rumbled, nodding once as he stepped into the center of the room. He looked as immaculate as if he'd spent the night sleeping in a silk hammock rather than overseeing a massacre at the railyards. He glanced over at Sarge, whose fingers hadn't missed a single beat on the Underwood. "Good morning, my dear." "Don Pandolini," Sarge said, her voice perfectly polite, never looking up from her typing. "Joe's gonna pull through," I told the old man, leaning against the door frame of my inner office. "The doctor said he's too damn stubborn to die." Pandolini's heavy lids drifted down in a brief, respectful acknowledgement. "A good soldier is a hard thing to lose. We will ensure his medical bills are heavily discounted." Before I could thank him, the heavy rhythmic thud of expensive wingtips echoed from the stairwell. The atmosphere in the room turned instantly to ice. The door opened again, and this time 3 men stepped through. Vince Marconi was in the lead, his cashmere coat unbuttoned, his mouth twisted into a smug, triumphant sneer. Behind him was an older man, short, stocky, with silver hair brushed straight back and a tailored wool suit that cost more than my DeSoto. His face was a mask of granite, Don Castellano himself. Behind the big boss stood a massive Chicago enforcer, whose knuckles looked like a collection of bruised walnuts. The enforcer immediately stepped toward Paulie and me, his hands out to frisk us. Paulie didn't blink, raising his arms casually. I did the same. The enforcer patted down our ribs, our hips, and our ankles, finding nothing but air. He glanced over at Sarge, still typing away in her blazer, but Castellano gave a subtle wave of his hand, dismissing it. You don't frisk the secretary. It's bad form. Don Pandolini, Castellano said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of the East Coast syndicate. It has been too many years. Castellano, Pandolini replied, his tone flat, even, and dangerous. Let us step into Mr. Morgan's office. The air out here is too thick for old men. We filed into my inner office. I took the squeaking leather chair behind my desk. Pandolini and Castellano took the two leather armchairs opposite me. Paulie stood by the filing cabinet near the window, his arms crossed, while Marconi, dog-face, handsome, and the Chicago enforcer lined the walls like gargoyles. Don Castellano broke the silence, leaning forward and resting his manicured hands on the edge of my mahogany desk. Let's get straight to the bottom line, Pandolini. My family has spent too much money and lost too many scouts in this basin over a simple family matter. The girl is dead. The junkie is dead. The ledger is clear. We are here to talk about how we share the freight manifests out of Glendale so we don't have to keep painting your railyards red. Pandolini didn't flinch. He leaned back, his fingers interlocking over his stomach. The Glendale manifests remain entirely under the local jurisdiction, Castellano. The City of Angels does not take orders from the cornfields. What I am looking for is a complete, permanent withdrawal of your scouts from the West Coast Basin. You keep your operations east of the Rockies, and we do not interfere with your shipping lines out of New York. Before Castellano could even draw a breath to respond, Vince Marconi took a violent step forward from the wall, his face flushing red with a sudden, arrogant heat. Who the hell are you to demand anything? Marconi interrupted, his sharp Chicago cadence cutting through the room like a chainsaw. He looked down at Pandolini with pure, unadulterated contempt. You have no leverage here, old man. We could take this whole fucking city if we wanted to. We have the muscle, we have the backing, and most importantly... He reached into his overcoat pocket and slammed the heavy velvet pouch onto my desk blotter with a hollow, metallic clunk. I have the cross. The Antwerp cross belongs to Chicago. You're holding a losing hand. Castellano's jaw tightened. He didn't look at Pandolini. He shot a blistering, lethal glare sideways at his nephew. Vince, the big boss warned, his voice dropping into a terrifying register. Keep your mouth shut. Sit down. But Marconi was too far gone, emboldened by the weight of the gold he was carrying, entirely blinded by his own arrogance. No, Uncle, I'm tired of playing nice with these local hicks. We won the rail yard. We hold the prize. They don't dictate terms to us. A low rumbling sound came from the corner of the room. It was Dogface. The massive enforcer was leaning against my bookshelves, a menacing, terrifying smile stretching across his scarred face. His eyes locked onto Marconi like a wolf looking at a tethered goat. You don't have shit, Dogface said, his voice a low, gravelly promise of violence. Marconi sneered, pointing a finger at him. I took it off the girl's corpse myself, you ugly bastard. It's right there in the bag. Pandolini looked down at the velvet pouch on my desk, a slow, terrible calm settling over his ancient features. He didn't even look up at Marconi when he spoke. Take a good look at that cross, Mr. Marconi, Pandolini said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor through silk. It's junk. Junk? What the hell are you talking about? Marconi asked, his voice cracking slightly under the sudden weight of the room's silence. Take a look. See for yourself, Pandolini said, his hand remaining motionless on his cane. Marcone ripped the velvet pouch off my desk blotter, his manicured fingers trembling with a mix of fury and sudden panic. He loosened the gold twine and tipped the bag over, pouring the contents onto the dark mahogany wood. The heavy object hit the desk with a hollow, brassy thwack. It was a cross, all right, but the gold plating was already flaking away at the edges, revealing the dull, cheap gray lead beneath it. The intricate carvings of the Antwerp artisans weren't there, just crude, machine-stamped lines meant to fool a man in a hurry in a dark rail yard. Marcone bent over, taking a good look at it. His face didn't just turn white. It went completely gray. "It's fake! This fucking thing is fake!" Marcone roared, slamming his hand down on the desk, his eyes bulging as he glared across at the old man. "What the hell have you done with the cross, you old bastard?" Don Castellano didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed into two slivers of lethal freezing glass. He looked at the cheap lead toy on the desk, then slowly turned his head to look up at his nephew. "It appears that you don't have the cross, Vince," Castellano said, his voice so quiet and flat it sounded like a funeral shroud dropping over a coffin. Pandolini let out a dry, rattling breath that might have been a laugh. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his overcoat just enough to reveal the pristine silk lining. "I switched the cross with the fake one hours before your boy even arrived at the switches, Castellano," Pandolini explained, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the price of citrus fruits. "Because I knew Evelyn Sinclair couldn't be trusted. I knew she would look for the highest bidder. And I knew your nephew was desperate enough to pull a trigger to get it." Castellano absorbed the information in silence, his jaw working a slow, rhythmic grind. He nodded once. "A smart play, Pandolini. So, what is the price of the genuine article?" Pandolini held up two fingers. "Two choices, Castellano. If you want the cross, return to your vault in Chicago. Your outfit either leaves this town completely by midnight tonight, or you work with the Pandolini family. A partnership on the shipping manifests under my terms, or a total exit. Los Angeles belongs to the locals." "I'll never work for you," Marcone screamed. The arrogance, the humiliation, and the sheer terror of what his uncle would do to him for bungling the biggest heist of the decade finally snapped the last thread of Vince Marcone's sanity. He took a violent step back into the doorway, his hand diving straight down toward the cuff of his trousers, reaching for the snub-nosed pistol hidden in his ankle holster. Before he could even fully straighten his back, the heavy silence of the office shattered into a deafening, overlapping roar. 3 pistols fired simultaneously. The roar of the hidden guns inside the small room was like a physical blow. The lead caught Marcone mid-rise. My Colt detective special from beneath the desk, Paulie's .32 from the couch cushions, and Sarge's nickel-plated .38 from the front desk all spoke at the exact same fraction of a second. Marcone didn't even have time to scream. The impact slammed his cashmere-clad frame back against the door frame before he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, rolling onto his back, his unfired snub nose clattering harmlessly away into the corner. He dropped dead right on the spot. The stench of sulfur and burnt gunpowder instantly filled the room, swirling in the yellow bands of sunlight cutting through the blinds. Nobody else moved. Dogface and Handsome hadn't shifted an inch, their hands still in their pockets, their smiles entirely unchanged. The big Chicago enforcer looked like he wanted to reach for something, but he was staring down the barrel of my smoking Colt, and Paulie had his piece leveled straight at Castellano's chest. Don Castellano didn't even look down at his nephew's corpse. He just slowly lifted a linen handkerchief from his pocket and delicately wiped a speck of blood from his tailored lapel. "The deal was no weapons, Pandolini," Castellano said, his voice a low, freezing vibration. "And I held up my end of the deal," Pandolini replied, his expression as flat and unreadable as an old tombstone. "My boys are not armed. take a look for yourself. But the employees of this agency? They do not work for me. This is their home turf, Castellano. You break the rules in a man's home, you pay the rent. Castellano let out a slow, heavy breath through his nose. He looked at me, then at Polly, and finally out toward the front desk where Sarge was already calmly setting the pistol back in her desk drawer. Pandolini rested his hands back on his cane. What is your decision, Mr. Castellano? Castellano looked back down at Vince Marconi. There was no grief in the old man's eyes, only the cold calculation of a ledger being balanced. With my nephew out of the way, things should run easier, Castellano said, his voice returning to its normal, business-like rasp. He looked across the desk at Pandolini. I have no choice. I will work with you. With our New York connections and your West Coast operations, it can be the biggest partnership in the country. Pandolini nodded once, a grim, final satisfaction settling over his ancient face. A wise choice. They leaned across my mahogany desk, right over the cheap, lead counterfeit cross, and shook hands. The grip was firm, brief, and binding, but Pandolini didn't let go of the man's hand right away. He leaned in just an inch closer, his dark eyes boring holes into the Chicago boss. If any of your guys tries to make a move on me, my guys, or anyone in this office, Pandolini said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I will spare no expense to personally cut your fucking throat. A ghost of a smile touched Castellano's granite lips. You still carry that old razor? It has been my faithful companion since we were running the streets as kids, Pandolini said softly. Castellano pulled his hand back and adjusted his cuffs. You have my word, Pandolini. Now, I need to catch the super chief back to Chicago. It's a long train ride, and I have a family to reorganize. He signaled his massive enforcer, pointing a finger down at the bloody mess blocking the doorway. Before the gorilla could even bend down, Sarge's voice cut through the gunsmoke from the front desk, sharp and uncompromising. Clean your boy off the floor, Sarge said, staring the Chicago boss right in the eyes. I just waxed it. She meant it, too. Chapter 10. The gunsmoke took all morning to finally clear out of the room, but the smell of burnt powder lingered in the drapes long after the Chicago enforcer had dragged Vince Marconi's heavy, ruined frame down the stairs. By 2 in the afternoon, the office was quiet again. The sun had burned through the LA smog, cast in long, peaceful stripes across the floorboards. Sarge's typewriter was silent for the first time all day. She sat at her front desk, methodically finishing the slice of cherry pie Rose had sent, her nickel-plated .38 resting safely back in its drawer. The frosted glass door opened, and Don Pandolini stepped back into the room alone. Handsome and dog-faced remained in the corridor, 2 silent figures guarding the stairs. The old man walked into my inner office and stood by the window, looking out at the bustling traffic on the boulevard below. He reached into his pristine overcoat, pulled out a heavy velvet pouch, the real one this time, and set it gently on my mahogany desk. Through the fabric, the distinct, sharp silhouette of the genuine Antwerp cross was unmistakable. Castellano's train has cleared the county line, Pandolini said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble. The relic is being shipped back east via a private, armored courier tonight. The treaty is signed, the port is secure, and Chicago will remain on their side of the mountains. Glad to hear it, Don Pandolini, I said, leaning back in my chair. It was a hell of a price to pay for a piece of old gold. Every ledger requires a balancing entry, Mr. Morgan, Pandolini said, turning away from the window. He reached into his jacket once more and slid a thick, heavy manila envelope across the desk blotter. It landed with a solid, satisfying thump. For St. Vincent's, to ensure Mr. Russo receives the finest surgeons and the quietest recovery room in the city, and a hefty bonus for the considerable maintenance required of your staff this morning. I opened the flap. Inside were crisp, bound stacks of $100 bills, enough to pay Joe's medical bills 10 times over, keep the agency flush for a year, and buy Sarge a brand new Underwood if she wanted one. "We appreciate the business, sir," I said, nodding respectfully. Pandolini offered a faint, fleeting smile that didn't touch his dark eyes. He adjusted his fedora, gripped his cane, and turned toward the door. "Give my regards to Joe. Tell him the city is still ours." After the door clicked shut behind Pandolini's entourage, I walked out to the front room and tossed a thick stack of the hundreds onto Sarge's desk blotter right next to her empty pie plate. She looked at the money, then up at me, her brow raising a fraction of an inch. "You're cut for the floor wax," I told her with a grin. Right on cue, a faint, muffled meow came from under the steel filing cabinet. Hammett finally peeked his head out from behind a row of old case files. He blinked his green eyes against the afternoon light, his whiskers twitching as he looked around the office, sniffing the sharp scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air. He'd been holed up in there since the first shot fired. "Well, look who decided to rejoin society," Sarge dryly noted, reaching down to scratch him behind the ears. "The brave detective himself." Hammett walked out, stretched his hind legs, and walked right over to Sarge's desk, confidently sniffing the leftover crust of Rose's cherry pie before giving his paws a thorough washing. "You should have scratched their eyes out," Polly chimed in from the couch, cracking a rare smile as the cat strutted past him. "Keep an eye on the place, Hammett," I said, pocketing the hospital envelope and grabbing my overcoat. "And don't touch my scotch while we're gone." 20 minutes later, Polly, Sarge, and I walked into the recovery ward at St. Vincent's. The room was bathed in the warm orange glow of the late afternoon sun. True to her word, Rose was already there. Her diner shift had ended, and she was sitting in the metal chair right beside the mattress, looking sharp and beautiful, though her face still carried the exhaustion of the morning. She was currently holding a small spoon, trying to force a trembling cube of green hospital gelatin into Joe's mouth. Joe was having none of it. His face was the color of a wet sidewalk, but his stubbornness was at an absolute premium. "Look at this," Joe grumbled the second my boots hit the linoleum. "Jack, thank God. Tell her, they're trying to poison me. It doesn't even taste like food. It tastes like sweetened glue. Eat your lime jello, Joe, or so help me. I'll let the nurse bring the cabbage soup," Rose snapped, though the relief in her eyes when she looked up at the three of us was unmistakable. She set the spoon down and stood up, immediately checking us over for any fresh bullet holes. "You're all intact. Thank heaven." "We're fine, Rosie," I said, giving her a quick squeeze. The old man closed the book. "Chicago is on the super chief, the Cross is heading back to the cornfields, and Pandolini paid the rent." Joe leaned back against his thin pillows, wincing slightly as the movement tugged at his stitched-up thigh. He looked over at Sarge, then at me, a knowing, tired smirk spreading across his face. "Did the office survive the summit?" "Not a scratch on the plaster," Sarge said, stepping up to the foot of the bed and crossing her arms. "Though next time you boys invite the Midwest syndicate over for a chat, tell them to wipe their boots at the door. I just waxed those floors on Friday, Russo. I was afraid Marconi was going to scratch it when he dropped like a stone. It's coming out of your vacation fund." "Marconi's dead?" Joe asked, his eyebrows shooting up. "As a mackerel," Polly said flatly. "Took 3 to the button, barely a wrinkle his suit, before he hit the deck." Joe let out a real booming laugh at that, then immediately clutched thigh, groaning, "Ow, damn it, don't make me laugh. The stitches feel like piano wire." "Then stop talking and start resting," Sarge said. She walked around the side of the bed, pushing Rose gently to the side. For all of Sarge's tough-as-nails military exterior, she looked down at Joe with a softness she rarely let anyone see. She leaned over the guardrail, pressed a firm, lingering kiss right against his pale forehead, and then patted his shoulder with a hand that had been holding a smoking .38 just hours ago. "That's an official order from the front desk, Russo," Sarge murmured, her voice dropping into a warm, commanding tone. "Get better. The paperwork is piling up, and Hammett is currently guarding the office. If you aren't back at your desk in a month, I might actually have to let the cat run the agency." Joe smiled, his eyelids already getting heavy from the fresh dose of morphine the nurse had slipped into his IV bottle. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "I'll be good." I looked around the room, at my partner who was going to walk again, at the woman who kept me grounded, and at the crew that had held the line when the basin went to war. The air still smelled faintly of that weird smell of hospital, but through the open window, the cool Pacific breeze was blowing into the ward, washing away the lingering stench of blood and gunpowder. The treaty was signed, and the money was in the safe. But in this city, a clean ledger never stays clean for long. I checked my pocket watch. It was nearing 4 in the afternoon. "Come on, Paulie," I said, adjusting the brim of my hat. "Let's leave him to his jello. We've got a stop to make before the sun goes down. Rose, Sarge, are you coming?" We left the sterile white halls of St. Vincent's behind just as the street lamps were flickering to life, casting long amber reflections across the damp pavement. By 8 o'clock, the entire crew was gathered in the back booth of the Blue Room, our usual watering hole, down on the boulevard where the lighting was low, the vinyl booths were cracked, and the bartender didn't ask questions about the faint smell of gunpowder lingering on our overcoats. Joe was still stuck hooked up to a tube at the hospital, but we made sure his presence was felt by setting an empty highball glass right in the center of the table, filling it straight to the brim with his favorite rye. "To Joe," I said, lifting my glass of scotch. "May his leg heal fast and his belly aching end sooner." "To Joe," the table echoed, glasses clinking together in a loud, chaotic chorus. It was a strange crew filling out that oversized leather booth. "I gotta ask, Sarge," Handsome said, flashed that blinding, terrifyingly perfect smile of his as he leaned his elbows on the table. "When you racked that nickel-plated 38 this morning, did you actually have a target lined up? Or were you just trying to scare the cashmere off Marcone?" Sarge didn't even blink. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her gin and tonic, set the glass down with a soft thud, and looked him dead in the eye. "George, if I was trying to scare him, I would have aimed for his head. I went for center mass because I didn't want the brains leaking onto the baseboards. I just waxed those damn floors." Dogface let out a low, gravelly chuckle that sounded like a shovel scraping across gravel. He slammed a heavy, scarred fist onto the table, making the glasses rattle. "She's a keeper, Morgan. If she ever gets tired of typing your little reports, I can find her a spot in our collections department. She's got the temperament for it." "Keep your hands off my staff, dog face," I warned with a grin, raising my glass. "She's the only one who knows where the spare typewriter ribbons are kept. Besides, you couldn't afford her." "Damn right you can't," Sarge muttered, though a faint smirk touched the corners of her lips. As the night wore on, the tension that had been coiling inside us since the railyards finally began to snap, strand by strand. The drinks kept coming, and the jokes got louder. Rose laughed until tears pricked the corners of her eyes, her hand resting comfortably in mine beneath the edge of the table. For a few hours, nobody talked about the cross. Nobody talked about Chicago, or the blood on the rail yard switches, or the shadows that always seemed to follow us down the alleyways of this town. We just drank, laughed, and leaned into the comforting warmth of each other's company. In our line of work, you learned early on that peace is a fragile, fleeting thing. You don't get many nights where everyone you care about is still breathing, still whole, and still sitting at the same table. Around midnight, I looked across the rim of my glass at the faces surrounding me. The neon sign outside the window buzzed a steady, rhythmic note, painting the booth in shades of electric blue and crimson. Tomorrow morning would come, sure as the tide. The sun would rise over the smog. The frosted glass door of the Morgan and Russo Detective Agency would unlock, and Hammett would be waiting by the filing cabinet for his saucer of milk. And sooner or later, a new client would walk through that door with a fresh bag of trouble, forcing us right back into the mud. But tonight, the ledger was balanced. The wolves were held at bay, the rye was smooth, and the laughter was real. And in this damn city, that was about as close to a happy ending as you can get.